Tonight we step into a world where winter was not a season of pretty snow and candlelit comfort, but an enemy that pressed its white face against the door, crept through the walls, settled in the bones, and waited. Imagine a small household somewhere in medieval Europe, perhaps in a village beside a dark woodland, perhaps on a windswept hill, perhaps near the wet fields of a lord's manor. The sun has gone down early. The sky is iron. Frost gathers on the threshold. Smoke from the hearth hangs beneath the rafters because the chimney, if there is one at all, draws poorly. A child coughs in the straw. A woman bends over a blackened pot, stirring pottage with a wooden spoon. An old man sits close to the fire, not because he is comfortable, but because moving farther away would let the cold take possession of him. There is no glass in the small window, only a shutter, oiled cloth, or a scraped animal membrane that lets in a little grey light by day and too much cold by night. There is no central heating, no insulated roof, no certainty that tomorrow's meal will be enough. The house smells of smoke, damp wool, old straw, stored onions, human breath, and animals. The floor is hard earth. The walls may be wattle and daub, timber, turf, clay, or stone. Each material holds back the weather only imperfectly. Winter finds the cracks. For the medieval family, cold was not simply discomfort. Cold was a force that changed the body, the mind, and the rhythm of the entire year. It made fingers useless. It stiffened leather shoes. It froze water in buckets. It turned mud into ridges as hard as iron. It made the weak sleep too long. It made the sick weaker. It made hunger sharper. It made silence deeper. This was the brutal reality of medieval winter, and yet families endured it. They endured it without modern medicine. They endured it without supermarkets. They endured it without electric light, weather forecasts, waterproof coats, or emergency services. Their survival depended on memory, labour, custom, cooperation, and luck. Above all, it depended on preparation. A household did not begin surviving winter when the snow came. It began surviving winter months earlier, in the heat of summer, in the work of harvest, in the cutting of wood, in the salting of meat, in the drying of herbs, in the gathering of nuts, in the storing of grain, in the careful keeping of every rag, every scrap, every ember. To understand medieval winter, we must abandon the modern idea that cold is merely weather. For them, cold was a test of social order. It revealed who had land and who did not. It revealed who had kin and who stood alone. It revealed whether the harvest had been generous, whether the Lord had demanded too much, whether the church tithe had left enough behind, whether the roof had been repaired in time, whether the cow had lived, whether the wood still offered fuel, whether the baby born in autumn had strength enough to see spring. In royal chronicles, winter sometimes appears as a backdrop to war, coronations, rebellions, and plague. But inside the ordinary home, winter was the true sovereign. It commanded when people rose, when they worked, when they slept, what they ate, how much they spoke, and how close they sat to one another. It made families gather in one room, bodies clustered around flame, sharing heat the way they shared bread. In that closeness there was tenderness, but also tension. Privacy shrank, temper sharpened, grief had nowhere to go. The evidence comes to us in fragments. Archaeology gives us hearths, floor layers, animal bones, storage pits, roof timbers, soot-blackened walls, and the remains of simple objects worn by ordinary hands. Stratigraphic excavation can reveal how homes were rebuilt, repaired, abandoned, or expanded. Pollen analysis and environmental data show us colder periods, crop stress, woodland use, and the changing pressure on land. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, lets scholars date timber and glimpse years of hard growth. Written records, where they survive, speak of rents paid in grain, rights to gather firewood, failures of harvest, and the terrifying language of famine. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No document records every shiver. No clerk wrote down the exact moment when a mother gave her blanket to a feverish child. No account book tells us how fear sounded when the last bundle of sticks was brought inside and the snow was still falling. The past leaves evidence, but not always mercy. It gives us bones and buildings, but asks us to imagine breath in the dark. A medieval winter evening began early. As daylight faded, work slowed, though it rarely stopped. Someone had to tend the animals. Someone had to fetch water if the source had not frozen. Someone had to repair clothing, twist fibre, sharpen a tool, patch a shoe, skim the pot, bank the fire, soothe the children, check the door. The night outside was not empty. It held wolves in some regions, thieves in others, and always the cold. The door was a boundary between the known and the unknown. Beyond it lay frozen roads, black hedges, hard fields, and a sky crowded with stars brighter than most of us will ever see. Inside, light came from the fire, rushlights, tallow candles, or a small oil lamp if the household could afford it. The glow was weak, smoky, and precious. Darkness was not romantic. It was practical, heavy, and long. In winter, night could last more than half the day. People slept in shifts or woke often. They listened to the fire settle. They listened to animals shift in the byre. They listened to wind testing the roof. The hearth was the heart of survival. It cooked food, dried clothes, warmed bodies, hardened tools, smoked meat, and gave psychological comfort. A dead hearth in deep winter was a disaster. Fire had to be guarded, fed, and respected. Embers were banked under ash to preserve them through the night. In some homes, flame was shared between neighbours, carried carefully from one hearth to another. To lose fire was to become vulnerable at once, and so the family gathered close. Their clothing was layered, often coarse, sometimes damp, sometimes patched many times over. Wool was the great guardian of medieval bodies. Linen touched the skin, cloaks, hoods, hose, caps, mittens, wraps, and blankets created a defence against the air. The poor wore what they had, not what they wished. Clothing was not fashion first, it was shelter made portable. Food was simple and repetitive, pottage thickened with grains, peas, beans, leeks, cabbage, or whatever could be spared. Bread, if grain held out. Cheese, if there was any. Salted meat on better days. Ale, small beer, or water, depending on place and means. The winter table did not overflow for most families. It was measured, watched, and stretched. Hunger was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet, a steady narrowing of portions, a child given the softer piece, an elder pretending not to want more. This is where the true story lies, not only in castles, battles, or kings, but in the ordinary household that made it to dawn. The medieval family survived winter through discipline and intimacy, through hard choices and inherited knowledge, through community obligations and private sacrifices. They survived by accepting that comfort was rare, but endurance was necessary. Tonight, we enter that cold room. We sit beside the smoking hearth. We listen to the wind crossing the fields. We watch the family draw closer, not because the world is gentle, but because beyond the firelight the cold is waiting, patient and without pity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as the night gathers around you, write in the comments where you're watching from, and what the local time is in your corner of the world. The year turns against them. For a medieval family, Winter did not arrive with the first snow. It arrived in the mind long before the fields hardened. It was felt in the last warm evenings of summer, when the light began to lower and every sensible person looked at the sky with calculation rather than wonder. The household knew that warmth was a passing guest. The earth might still be generous, the hedges still green, the streams still lively over stone. But beneath all of it there was a question. Would there be enough? Enough grain, enough wood, enough salt, enough straw, enough strength, enough hands to work before the cold closed around them? The medieval year was not a neat circle of festivals and ploughing songs. It was a struggle of timing. One mistake could echo for months. One wet harvest could spoil the grain. One sick ox could slow the plough. One early frost could blacken the beans. One dead pig could mean the loss of meat, fat, bristles, bone, blood, and winter hope. Late summer and autumn were the seasons of judgment. The family entered them with the memory of past winters still living in their bodies. The old remembered the year when the rye failed. The mother remembered the child who weakened during the long wet cold. The father remembered trudging to the woodland for fuel while the snow crust cut his ankles. Children learned by watching. They saw anxiety in the way adults inspected the granary. They heard it in the pause before a sack was opened. They understood that bread was not merely food. Bread was time. Harvest was the great turning point. In fields owned by lord, church, or peasant, people worked from dawn until the light died. Men, women, children, servants, and the elderly all had tasks. Sickles flashed through the standing grain. Bundles were tied, stacked, carried, and guarded. Every fallen head mattered. Gleaners moved across the stubble searching for missed stalks, bending again and again until their backs ached. For the poorest, gleaning could be the difference between thin survival and disaster. The sound of harvest was not peaceful. It was urgent. Blades rasped, carts groaned, voices called across the fields. Dust rose from dry grain. Sweat darkened wool and linen. Hands blistered and split. Flies gathered. Clouds were watched with suspicion. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten the crop, soak it, rot it, or scatter it. When rain threatened, speed became desperation. Once cut, the grain still had to be saved. It had to dry. It had to be threshed. It had to be winnowed. It had to be stored away from damp, rats, mice, birds, insects, and theft. A granary was a fortress against hunger, but no fortress was perfect. Rodents could enter where a finger could fit. Moisture could creep silently into a corner. Mould could spread like a hidden curse. A family might think itself safe in October, only to discover in January that part of its store had spoiled. The Lord's share, the church tithe, rents, debts, seed grain for planting, and food for animals all pressed against the household's hopes. What remained for eating could look smaller than expected. Medieval people were not ignorant of arithmetic. They measured with eyes trained by necessity. They knew the pace at which a bin emptied. They knew how long a loaf lasted. They knew how many mouths sat by the hearth. They knew, with a cold, private knowledge, when the figures did not favour them. Autumn was also slaughter time. Animals could not all be fed through winter. Hay was costly in labour and land. Grain was too valuable. So choices had to be made. The breeding animals were kept if possible. The weak, the surplus, the old, and the unlucky were killed. The slaughter of a pig was not only a butchery, it was a household event heavy with smell, noise, skill, and necessity. Blood was caught, fat was rendered, meat was salted, smoked, dried, or eaten quickly before it spoiled. Bones became broth, guts became casings. Nothing was wasted unless misfortune forced waste. The smell of smoke and meat might suggest abundance, yet beneath it lay a harsher truth. The family was eating because it could not afford to keep everything alive. Preservation was a science of the poor as much as the craft of monasteries and manors. Salt drew water from flesh and slowed decay. Smoke darkened rafters and hardened meat. Vinegar sharpened vegetables, drying concentrated fruit, herbs, fish, and pulses. Cheese kept milk beyond the season of milk. Ale made grain drinkable and safer in many places than water drawn from doubtful sources. These were not quaint traditions. They were technologies of survival, perfected through repetition, failure, and inherited instruction. In cottage gardens, the last produce was pulled from the earth. Onions were strung, beans were dried, cabbages were stored. Leeks remained in the ground where climate allowed. Turnips, parsnips, and other roots were lifted or protected. Apples were wrapped or laid carefully. Nuts were gathered from woodland edges. Berries were dried where possible. Herbs were tied in bunches and hung from beams, their summer scent fading slowly in the smoky air. Children were sent to collect what small hands could carry: sticks, acorns, kindling, mushrooms if the family knew them safely, fallen fruit, rushes, nuts, and dry bracken. In some places they watched geese, pigs, or sheep. They learned that the world had useful things scattered everywhere, but only for those who knew when to take them. A lazy day in autumn might become an empty bowl in winter. Fuel demanded equal attention. Wood had to be cut, gathered, split, dried, stacked, and protected from rain. Green wood smoked badly and burned poorly. Dry wood was gold. In regions where peat was used, it had to be cut and dried in advance, each block a promise against future cold. Dung could be shaped and dried for burning where wood was scarce. Straw might be needed for bedding, thatch, animals, and fuel, each use competing with the others. Rights to gather fuel were often bound by custom and controlled by authority. The woodland was not simply open freedom. It had owners, laws, privileges, and punishments. A poor family might depend on dead wood, fallen branches, or limited rights in common land. The difference between permitted gathering and theft could be thin, especially when children were cold. Roofs were repaired before the worst weather. Thatch was patched. Stones were reset. Mud walls were renewed. Gaps were stuffed with moss, straw, clay, rags, or whatever could slow the wind. Bedding was aired when possible. Straw mattresses were replaced if the household had enough straw to spare. Blankets were mended, shoes were patched, cloaks were inspected. A cracked sole in winter could be more than inconvenience. Wet feet could become sickness. Sickness could become absence from work. Absence from work could become hunger. Medieval survival was communal, but it was not sentimental. Neighbours helped one another because life demanded networks. They shared tools, news, labour, fire, and sometimes food. Yet every household also guarded its own stores. Charity existed, especially through church teaching or kinship and custom, but scarcity made generosity difficult. A village could be close and watchful at the same time. People knew who had grain, they knew who had slaughtered, they knew whose roof leaked, they knew whose children looked thin. As the days shortened, the work moved inward, the fields emptied, the house became workshop, storehouse, shelter, nursery, sick room, kitchen, and chapel of ordinary fear. Flax and wool waited to be spun, tools waited to be repaired, nets, baskets, shoes, harness, and clothing waited for hands. The family did not stop producing because the ground rested. Winter labour became quieter, smaller, more repetitive, but never unimportant. The turning of the year was marked by bells, Saints' days, rents due, obligations owed, and prayers spoken into colder air. Faith shaped the calendar, giving meaning to hunger and darkness. Yet faith did not remove the need to count loaves. Medieval people prayed, but they also salted meat. They trusted God, but they also checked the roof. They hoped for mercy, but they stacked firewood. By the time true cold settled, the household's fate was partly written. The stores in the dark, the wood against the wall, the salted meat hanging from the beam, the grain hidden from vermin, the animals chosen for life or death, the clothing repaired by candlelight, the debts that still had to be paid, the neighbours who might help, the children strong enough, perhaps, to last. Winter was not only endured in the moment, it was survived by everything done before the door was shut against it. And so, as frost took the fields and the first hard mornings arrived, the family entered the dangerous season with whatever the year had granted them and whatever human labour had managed to defend. Walls of wattle, stone and smoke. A medieval house was not merely a place where a family lived. It was the shell between life and weather, a handmade barrier raised against rain, wind, animals, darkness, and the slow cruelty of cold. To modern eyes, many such homes might appear rough, cramped, and fragile. But to the people who built them, they were the result of local knowledge, inherited craft, and the stubborn intelligence of survival. The house began with what the land allowed. In wooded country, timber gave the frame. Upright posts were set into the ground or raised on stone footings if fortune and resources permitted. Between the timbers, walls might be filled with wattle and daub, a lattice of woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, dung, and earth. When dried, it could harden into a surprisingly effective surface, though one always at war with damp, frost, and time. In stony uplands, walls might be built of rough stone, heavy and cold to the touch, but strong against wind. In marshland or exposed regions, turf, clay, reed, and sod might be used. The medieval home was not one design. It was a conversation with the local earth. Archaeology often finds these houses not as complete buildings, but as absences. Post holes darkened in the soil, hearth stains, charcoal flecks, floor layers, collapsed daub bearing the marks of woven rods. Stratigraphic excavation can reveal where one floor was laid above another, where a hearth was shifted, where a wall was rebuilt, where a family repaired what winter had damaged. The ordinary house decayed back into the ground, yet its traces remain like whispers beneath the plough. Inside, warmth was a problem without a perfect solution. The walls kept out the worst of the weather, but they did not seal the house. Cold air entered under doors, through shutters, between boards, through roof edges, and through every weakness in the fabric. A family could stuff gaps with rags, moss, clay, straw, or animal skins, but air still found a way. The winter house breathed, and its breath was cold. The roof mattered as much as the wall. Thatch, made from straw, reed, rush, or heather, could be warm when well made, because it trapped air within its thickness. Yet thatch demanded maintenance. Birds pulled at it, rain worked into it, wind lifted it. Sparks threatened it, snow weighed upon it. A neglected roof was a danger not only because of leaking water, but because dampness stole heat from everything it touched. A wet bed, a wet cloak, a wet floor, a wet wall. All became enemies of the body. The floor was often beaten earth, sometimes mixed and tamped with clay, ash, or lime. It held footprints, spills, soot, straw, and the daily debris of life. In wealthier homes, timber floors or stone paving might appear, but for countless families the earth remained underfoot. Rushes, straw, or bracken could be scattered to soften and absorb filth, though such coverings could shelter fleas, lice, damp, and rot if not changed. Comfort and hazard lived together in the same material. At the centre stood the hearth. It might be an open fire set on the floor with smoke rising into the roof space and escaping through a smoke hole, louver doorway or imperfect thatch. A chimney, in poorer rural houses, was not guaranteed. The fire warmed, cooked, lit, and dried, but it also filled the home with smoke. Eyes stung, throats roughened, lungs suffered, rafters blackened with soot, meat, herbs, clothing, and beams all absorbed the smell. The medieval home in winter was not clean air with a pleasant fire. It was a smoky chamber where warmth came at a price. Yet smoke had uses. It discouraged some insects. It helped preserve meat. It darkened the high places and gave the house its smell of endurance. In the roof timbers, soot built up year by year, making visible the passage of cold seasons. A house remembered winter in black layers. Families arranged themselves according to heat. The best space was near the fire. The old, the sick, and young children might be kept closest when possible. Those with stronger bodies could endure the colder margins. At night, people slept near one another, sometimes in shared beds or on straw pallets. Bedding was not a private luxury. It was a survival system. Blankets, cloaks, animal skins, sacks, and bodies all worked together to conserve warmth. The bed of a poor household might be no more than a straw mattress, a wooden frame, a chest used as support, or a pallet laid near the wall. Straw needed changing, but spare straw could be precious, especially where animals required it. Old bedding could hold vermin, lice, fleas, mites, and mice were part of the winter interior. The cold did not purify the house, it only drove more creatures inward. Privacy was almost unknown by modern standards. A single room might hold sleeping, cooking, storage, craft work, childbirth, nursing, sickness, argument, prayer, and death. In many homes, people and animals shared the same structure, sometimes separated by a partition, sometimes by a lower byre area, sometimes by little more than habit. The presence of animals brought warmth, smell, flies, dung, noise, and risk. It also brought wealth. A cow breathing in the dark was not filth alone, it was milk, status, manure, traction, and future survival. Light altered the experience of space. By day, small openings admitted a pale winter glow. Glass was costly and uncommon in many rural homes for much of the medieval period. A shutter kept out weather, but also kept out light. Thin horn, linen, parchment, or oiled cloth might soften the problem for those who could manage it. Many homes therefore existed in half-darkness. Corners were shadowed. Smoke blurred the rafters. Faces appeared and vanished in firelight. The medieval house was filled with objects that mattered: a chest for storing cloth or grain, a hanging pot, wooden bowls, a quern for grinding, hooks, pegs, knives, baskets, spindle, loom weights, tubs, sacks, tools, ropes, and bundles of kindling. These things were not decorative clutter. They were the machinery of domestic life. In winter, when outside labour narrowed, the interior became a small factory of maintenance. Every item had a place because disorder wasted time and cold punished delay. To keep warmth, the family also managed movement. Doors were not opened casually. Every entry released heat and admitted air. Children learned to close shutters quickly. Wet clothing was hung near the hearth, though too near could scorch it. Shoes were dried carefully because cracked leather meant pain. Pots were kept simmering not only for food but for heat and humidity. Ashes were handled with caution. Embers were hidden under ash at night to preserve fire until morning. A well-built medieval house did not defeat winter. It negotiated with it. It slowed the cold, softened the wind, gathered human and animal warmth into one defensible place. Its power lay not in comfort, but in concentration. Everything valuable drew inward. Food, tools, fire, children, old people, memory, fear, prayer. For the wealthy Sasso, stone halls, private chambers, tapestries, glazed windows, fireplaces, raised beds, and servants changed the experience of winter, but did not erase the season's authority. Even castles could be cold. Stone held chill, with grim loyalty. Large halls swallowed heat. A fire might blaze magnificently and still leave the far corners bitter. Luxury improved survival, but winter remained a presence, pacing the corridors. For the poor, the house was intimate because it had to be. There was little wasted space. Nothing stood far from necessity. The smell of the cooking pot mingled with damp wool. The baby slept where smoke drifted. The old told stories where their feet could reach the heat. The dog, if there was one, curled in ashes or straw. Outside, the roof carried frost. Inside, the walls sweated, smoked, and endured. Such homes were vulnerable to disaster. Fire could take a thatched roof in moments. A storm could tear at the covering. Flood could soften walls. Heavy snow could break weakened timber. If a house failed in deep winter, repair became an emergency. Neighbours might come, kin might help, but materials were hard to gather in frozen weather, and every hour without shelter mattered. Still, these houses stood for generations in altered form, patched again and again, each repair a small defiance, a new layer of daub, a replaced post, fresh thatch, a tightened door, a blocked crack, a raised threshold, a shifted hearth. Medieval domestic architecture was not still. It was living work, shaped by seasons, bodies, and need. When we imagine such a room, we should not think only of misery. There was hardship, certainly, but also skill. There was discomfort, but also adaptation. The family knew where the warmest place lay. They knew which wall sweated in rain. They knew how smoke moved with the wind. They knew how to bank a fire, how to dry wool without burning it, how to sleep close without crushing the smallest child, how to listen when a roof beam creaked under snow. Their house was imperfect, smoky, dark, and cold by our standards. Yet it was also a vessel of survival, against the immense winter sky, against fields locked in frost, against the long night and the hunger of the wind. Those walls of wattle, stone, turf, timber, clay, and smoke held a family together. Not warmly, perhaps not gently, but enough, clothing against the killing air. In the depth of medieval winter, clothing was not decoration. It was a wool worn on the body, a portable shelter made from wool, linen, leather, fur, thread, sweat, and endless repair. A person badly dressed against the cold didn't merely suffer. They lost strength. Their hands slowed, their feet numbed, their breath shortened. Work became clumsy. Clumsiness became injury. Injury became hunger. In such a world, a sleeve, a hood, a mitten, or a dry pair of wrappings could hold the distance between endurance and collapse. The first truth of medieval clothing was that most people owned very little. A peasant family did not possess wardrobes filled with seasonal choices. Garments were expensive because cloth was expensive. Cloth required land, animals, fibre, washing, combing, spinning, weaving, fulling, cutting, stitching, and time. A simple tunic carried within it the labour of many hands. Even a patched garment represented value. Clothing was worn until it thinned, then patched, then altered, then passed down, then cut into smaller garments, then used as wrapping, then used as rags. Nothing soft was wasted against a skin. Many wore linen if they could afford it. Linen could be washed more easily than wool, and served as a layer between the body and outer clothing. A linen shirt or shift absorbed sweat and body oils, protecting heavier garments from filth. In cold weather, however, linen alone gave little comfort. It cooled quickly when damp. To stand in a wet linen underlayer in winter was to feel the cold enter with quiet confidence. Wool was the great defender. It came from sheep, but not as a gift easily received. The fleece had to be shorn, cleaned, teased, combed or carded, spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and often fulled to make it denser. Good wool could hold warmth even when slightly damp. Thick wool trapped air. Cloaks, tunics, hose, hoods, caps, blankets, and wraps made from wool formed the main armour of common winter life. Coarse wool scratched. It smelled when wet. It held smoke. It collected burrs, grease, mud, and lice. Still, it saved lives. Layering mattered deeply. A medieval worker might wear a linen undergarment, a wool tunic, hose or leg coverings, a belt, a hood, a cloak, and perhaps additional wraps around the feet or shoulders. The belt was practical, not merely ornamental. It gathered cloth close to the body, keeping drafts from moving freely beneath garments. It also held tools, a knife, a pouch, or small necessities. Loose clothing could be warm in stillness, but in wind. Gaps became channels for cold air. The head demanded protection. Much body heat was lost when the head and neck were exposed, especially in wind and damp. Hoods were among the most useful garments of medieval winter. A hood covered the head, neck, and sometimes shoulders, guarding the places where cold most loved to enter. Caps, coifs, veils, wimples, and wrapped cloth could all serve practical warmth as well as modesty, custom, or status. To see a medieval head uncovered in bitter weather would be to see vulnerability. Hands were another battlefield, fingers are delicate tools, and medieval labour required them constantly. Chopping wood, milking, tying knots, carrying water, grinding grain, handling reins, mending nets, turning spits, spinning wool, and fastening clothing all depended on hands that could still obey the mind. Mittens were warmer than gloves because fingers shared heat, but gloves allowed more precision. Poor families might use woolen wrappings, skins, or sleeves pulled down over the hands. A worker might warm fingers inside the armpit, breathe on them, or pause near a fire until feeling returned. Feet suffered terribly. Medieval shoes varied by period, place, and wealth, but many were made of leather, sometimes turned and stitched, sometimes simple, sometimes lined, sometimes not. Leather could protect against rough ground, but it was not automatically warm. Wet leather became cold, stiff, and damaging. In snow, mud, and freezing rain, feet could remain damp for hours. Wrappings of wool, cloth, straw, or fur might be used inside footwear. Wooden pattens or overshoes could raise the foot above mud and filth in towns, though not every labourer had them. The poor sometimes faced winter with shoes that were cracked, thin, or shared. A child might inherit footwear too large or too worn. A family could stuff empty space with straw, frostbitten toes, sores, chilblains, cracked heels, and infected cuts were not minor troubles. A person unable to walk could not fetch water, tend animals, gather fuel, or work for wages. Feet carried the household's survival. Keeping clothing dry was as important as keeping it thick. Wet cold is merciless. Snow melting into wool, rain soaking a cloak, sweat trapped beneath layers. river water splashed over shoes, all could turn a person's garments into a burden. Medieval people understood this through experience, not theory. They dried clothes near the hearth, shook snow from cloaks before entering, hung damp hose from beams, and guarded spare cloth from moisture. Yet drying was slow in smoky, crowded houses. Too close to the fire, cloth scorched or caught flame. Too far away, it stayed damp and chilled the next body that wore it. Cloaks were among the most important outer garments. A cloak could serve as coat, blanket, hood, bundle carrier, ground cover, privacy screen, and emergency bedding. It could be pinned at the shoulder or chest, wrapped tight in wind, spread over children, or doubled around an elder. In hard weather, a cloak was not an accessory. It was a movable roof. A good cloak might outlast years of use, accumulating patches like a map of hardship. Fur existed, but its meaning depended on status. The wealthy wore fine furs as signs of rank as well as warmth. Squirrel, ermine, marten, lambskin, rabbit, fox, and other pelts might appear in garments, linings, or trims according to wealth and local availability. Poorer people could use sheepskin, rough hides, or whatever pelts they could obtain, though fur required preparation and care. Raw skins stiffened, rotted, or smelled. Proper tanning and curing took skill. A sheepskin cloak or lining could be wonderfully warm, but not every household could afford such protection. Clothing also marked hierarchy. The lord in a fur-lined mantle and the cottager in patched wool did not meet winter equally. Rank could be seen in dye, cut, quantity, quality, and cleanliness. Certain colours required costly dyes. Fine cloth spoke of money before a person said a word. Sumptuary expectations and social custom often governed what people should wear according to status. Yet cold could make such distinctions feel both visible and cruel. The rich might complain of draughty halls while wrapped in costly fabric. The poor might wake with frost near the bed and only a mended blanket between themselves and pain. Children's clothing carried special difficulty. Children grew, and cloth did not grow with them. Garments were altered, let out, cut down, passed from older siblings to younger ones, patched at elbows and knees, belted high, folded, tightened, and improvised. A small child in winter needed warmth, but also freedom to move and work. Children who tended animals or gathered sticks could return soaked, muddy, and shaking. A mother or elder might scold them not because the wet hem was ugly, but because drying it would cost fuel, time, and worry. Women's winter clothing had to answer both modesty and labour. Long garments could be warm, but hems drag through mud and snow. Sleeves had to be practical for kneading, brewing, washing, nursing, cooking, spinning, and hauling. Aprons protected clothing from filth, because washing heavy wool was not simple. Head coverings helped retain warmth and kept the hair away from fire and work. During pregnancy or nursing, warmth became even more important, for the body was already burdened. A nursing mother in winter gave not only milk, but heat from her own flesh. Men working outdoors faced exposure for long hours. A ploughman in cold wind, a shepherd on frozen ground, a woodcutter under bare branches, a carter beside icy roads. Each depended on clothing that could withstand movement, sweat, and weather. Too much clothing during hard labour caused sweating, and sweat could become dangerous when the body cooled. Too little clothing let the wind bite through. Medieval workers learned to judge their layers, opening and tightening garments as the work changed. Monastic and clerical clothing followed rules of community and office, yet monks and priests also knew cold. Stone cloisters, unheated churches, night offices, thin fingers turning manuscript pages, breath visible in candlelight. These belong to the winter life of religious houses. Charity sometimes passed through clothing. Arms could include garments or cloth. To clothe the naked was not an abstract virtue. It was a practical rescue from cold. Urban winter brought different clothing problems. Streets were muddy, icy, crowded, and filthy. Artisans worked in shops that might be warmer than fields but still drafty and damp. Markets required standing in cold air. Beggars, labourers, widows, apprentices, and migrants could be judged instantly by the state of their garments. Clothing became a public announcement of fortune or failure. A torn cloak in a town was not merely cold. It was shame made visible. Laundry was limited by weather. Washing linen in cold water was painful. Drying it in winter could take a long time. Heavy wool was even harder. Smoke, sweat, grease, and dirt accumulated. Vermin found seams and folds. People beat, brushed, aired, scraped, and smoked garments. But cleanliness was constrained by fuel, water, and temperature. The medieval winter body was often a clothed body, rarely fully stripped, because undressing meant surrendering warmth. There was intimacy in clothing care. Someone spun the thread, someone wove or bought the cloth, someone cut and stitched, someone patched knees, darned hose, replaced ties, softened leather, greased shoes, adjusted a child's hood, wrapped an elder's shoulders, and dried a wet cloak by the hearth. These acts were not grand enough for chronicles, but they were the daily engineering of survival. A family might own one precious blanket that passed from lap to lap. A cloak might cover 2 sleeping children. A hood might be shared by whoever had to go outside. The best shoes might be worn by the person whose errand mattered most. Necessity created rules. Warmth was allocated. The cold taught people to value texture, the heavy fall of a wool cloak, the rough comfort of mittens, the stiff resistance of leather thawing near a fire, the prickling of straw inside a shoe, the blessed softness of dry linen after days of damp, the smell of sheep, smoke, sweat, and earth rising from garments that had worked as hard as their owners. To survive medieval winter, families did not simply wear clothing. They lived inside a fragile system of fibres and hides, each layer shaped by labour and scarcity. Every seam was a small boundary against the killing air. Every patch was a refusal to yield. Every dry sock, every tied hood, every wrapped hand, every cloak drawn tight beneath the chin was part of the long human argument with the winter. The body could not command the season, but with wool over shoulders, leather underfoot, cloth around the head, and another warm body nearby, it could continue. Firewood, peat, and sacred flame. In medieval winter, fire was more than heat. It was food made possible, water made warm. Darkness pushed back, sickness comforted, tools repaired, damp clothing rescued, and fear given a visible enemy. A flame in the hearth was a small sun placed at the centre of human life. Without it, the house became only a box of cold air. With it, even a poor room could become a place where breath continued. Fire began long before the match. To kindle flame required skill, patience, and dry material. Sparks might be struck from flint and steel into tinder, charred cloth, dry fungus, tow, straw, shavings, bark, or fine fibres could nurse a spark into a glow. Then came the careful feeding, a wisp of smoke, a red point, a breath given slowly, not too hard, a curl of flame, tiny sticks, larger sticks. At last, if all went well, the fire took hold and began its work. But in winter, starting a fire from nothing was miserable. Fingers were stiff. Tinder could be damp. Wind entered through cracks. Children cried. The pot waited empty. For this reason, embers were precious. A household often tried to keep fire alive from day to day, preserving the glowing heart under ash. The act of banking the fire at night was almost ceremonial in its importance. Too little ash, and the ember died. Too much smothering, and it failed. Too much air, and it burned away. A good keeper of the hearth understood the moods of flame. At dawn, someone would crouch close, stir the ash, search for the hidden red glow, and feed it again. That first renewed flame meant the household had crossed one more night. It meant pottage could be warmed. It meant hands could thaw. It meant light could return before the sun had fully risen. If the fire had died, the day began with difficulty. A neighbour's hearth might be visited, and a live coal carried home in a covered vessel or wrapped safely in ash. Fire was domestic, but it was also communal. Villages were networks of flame. Fuel was the great burden behind the visible comfort of the hearth. A fire eats constantly. It consumes the work of arms and backs, the rights of land, the memory of seasons, the patience of children sent out to gather sticks. In regions with woodland, fuel meant branches, logs, brush, coppiced poles, dead wood, and cut timber. In treeless areas, people turned to peat, turf, dried dung, straw, reeds, heather, gorse, or any material that would burn well enough to cook a meal and warm a hand. Wood was not simply picked up whenever one pleased. Medieval landscapes were governed by rights, customs, and ownership. Forests, chases, parks, commons, and village woods were carefully watched, because wood was money, power, building material, fencing, tools, carts, fuel, and habitat for game. The poor might have rights to gather fallen branches, a practice often limited by local custom. They might cut certain underwood at certain times. They might collect dead wood, but not fell living trees. To cross the line could invite fines, conflict, or punishment. For those with little land, the search for fuel could become one of winter's most punishing tasks. A child sent to gather sticks might return with a bundle hardly large enough for a morning. An old woman might know every hedgerow, every coppice edge, every place where windfall branches collected after storms. A labourer might carry a heavy faggot on his back, breath steaming, shoulders aching beneath the weight. Fuel was heat transformed into labour before it became meat again. The best firewood needed drying. Freshly cut green wood hissed, smoked, and wasted its strength in steam. Seasoned wood burned hotter and cleaner. Families who could plan ahead stacked wood in summer and autumn, covering it from rain, raising it from wet ground, arranging it so air could move through the pile. To own a dry stack by winter was a sign of competence and luck. To face deep cold with green wood was to sit in smoke and disappointment. Peat was another winter treasure where boglands provided it. Cut from wet ground in blocks, peat had to be dried carefully. Once ready, it burned with a distinct smell and a steady heat. The cutting of peat required knowledge of the land, the right season, and the labour to carry heavy, wet blocks before they dried. In some communities, peat banks were as important as woodlands. A stack of dried peat was stored sunlight from ancient marshes, lifted by hand and carried into human rooms. Dried dung, too, could become fuel. To modern ears, this may sound desperate, but in many parts of the world and across many centuries, animal dung has been shaped, dried, and burned effectively. It was not simply filth. It was stored plant matter transformed by animals and returned as heat. Where wood was scarce, no source of fire could be dismissed. Survival does not consult elegance. The hearth had to be managed with care. A large blaze might look comforting, but it could waste fuel. A slow, steady fire cooked better and lasted longer. Families learned to match flame to task. A quick hot fire for baking or boiling, a bed of coals for simmering, a smoky fire for curing, a banked fire for night. Fire economy was as important as food economy. Every stick burned too quickly was one less stick for the next freezing dawn. Cooking shaped the day around flame. The pot might hang from an iron hook, rest on stones, or stand on a trivet. Pottage simmered slowly, thickening with grain, vegetables, herbs, or scraps. Water warmed for washing or nursing. Milk could be heated. Ale or broth could be made comforting. In wealthier households, ovens, bakehouses, and larger hearths expanded the possibilities. For the ordinary family, one fire often served all purposes, and so timing mattered. Food, warmth, drying, and light competed for the same flames. Fire also dried the world. Wool cloaks steamed near it, shoes hardened beside it, damp straw was pulled close, tools were warmed before use, a frozen rope might be made flexible again, a baby's cloths might be dried as quickly as fuel allowed. Yet fire was dangerous precisely because everyone needed it. A stray spark could catch straw, a hanging cloth could fall, a child could stumble, a thatched roof could become a tower of flame. In crowded houses filled with dry bedding, smoke, animals, and tired people. The hearth was both protector and threat. Smoke was everywhere. It moved into hair, cloth, eyes, lungs, rafters, and food. It could be bitter, choking, familiar, and strangely reassuring. The smell of smoke meant warmth was present. It meant someone had fuel. It meant food might be near. Yet smoke also damaged bodies. Coughs deepened in winter. Eyes watered. Infants breathed the same air as the fire. Elders sat in haze because the warmth mattered more than clean breath, beyond physical survival. Flame carried spiritual meaning. Candles burned in churches. Lamps glowed before holy images. Bonfires marked seasons in some traditions. The household hearth could feel like a sacred centre, not necessarily in formal doctrine, but in lived experience. Around it, blessings were spoken, stories told, children quieted, tools mended, and the dead remembered. The fire gathered the living into a circle. Its light made faces appear from darkness like figures in an illuminated manuscript. There was also hierarchy in fuel. The wealthy could burn larger fires, command servants to fetch wood, maintain fireplaces, and enjoy candles with less calculation. Monasteries, castles, manor houses, and urban elites consumed enormous quantities of fuel for kitchens, halls, workshops, brewing, baking, heating, and hospitality. Their comfort rested on forests, carts, tenants, labourers, and rights. The poor measured their heat in handfuls. Still, even the humblest household possessed knowledge no lord could ignore: how to coax flame from embers, how to keep kindling dry, how to choose wood that would burn cleanly, how to use ash for cleaning, preservation, or the garden, how to place a pot for steady heat, how to sleep with the fire low but alive, how to carry a coal without losing it, how to feel by the skin, whether a room would remain survivable until morning. In the hard months, the question was never simply whether there was fire tonight. The question was whether there would be fire tomorrow, and the day after, and the cold day beyond that. A bright flame could comfort the eye while secretly devouring the household's future. A careful ember, dull beneath ash, could mean wisdom. So the family watched the hearth as one might watch a living creature. It needed feeding, guarding, restraint, and respect. It could warm the infant and burn the roof. It could soften a meal and fill the lungs with smoke. It could gather neighbours, or reveal that no fuel remained. It was servant, danger, companion, and judge. When the wind worried the walls and frost whitened the door, the fire answered with its small crackling language. It said not that winter was defeated, but that human beings had made a circle of light in the dark, and for one more hour, perhaps one more night, the cold would have to wait outside the reach of flame. Bread, pottage, salt, and hunger. In medieval winter, hunger did not always announce itself with famine cries or empty granaries. More often, it entered quietly. It sat beside the family at the table. It watched the knife cut thinner slices. It listened as the pot was stretched with more water. It measured the hands of the mother as she served one child a little more, and herself a little less. Hunger was not only the absence of food, it was the long arithmetic of fear. The medieval household lived by stored calories. When the earth slept, the family ate the memory of past labour. Grain from the harvest, beans dried in their pods, peas stored in sacks, onions hung from rafters, apple kept in straw, salted meat suspended in the smoke, cheese hardened on shelves, ale brewed from grain, nuts gathered from woods, roots buried in clamps or held in pits. Every bite in winter had been earned earlier, and every mistaken storage returned like a creditor. Bread was the foundation. It carried more than taste. It carried work, rent, weather, status, and survival. Wheat bread, pale and fine, belonged more often to the comfortable and wealthy. Rye, barley, oats, maslin, and mixed grains fed many ordinary households. In colder and poorer regions, oatcakes, coarse loaves, and dark breads were common. Bread could be dense, rough, sour, smoky, gritty from the millstone, and precious beyond beauty. To make bread, grain had to be ground. This could be done by hand on a quern, a laborious task that consumed time and strength, or at a mill where dues might be owed. The sound of grinding was one of the deep domestic sounds of survival. Stone turning against stone, grain cracking into meal, dust rising, shoulders aching. The flour was never merely an ingredient. It was fatigue made edible. The Lord's mill, where it existed, could bind the peasant to obligation. A family might not grind freely wherever it wished. Fees, customs, and restrictions made bread part of the structure of power. Even before a loaf reached the oven, it had passed through authority. The poor knew this intimately. They tasted hierarchy in the crust. Baking required heat, and heat required fuel. Some households baked in small domestic arrangements. Others used communal ovens or ovens controlled by lords. Where fuel was scarce, baking became strategic. A family might bake many loaves at once rather than waste fire on one. Stale bread was not discarded casually. It could be softened in broth, crumbled into pottage, soaked in ale, toasted, or eaten hard. Mould might be cut away if necessity pressed hard enough. The stomach was not sentimental. Pottage was the great winter food of ordinary life. It was not one recipe, but a category as broad as need. A pot could hold grains, peas, beans, cabbage, leeks, onions, roots, herbs, scraps of meat, bones, fat, cheese rinds, stale bread, and whatever the season allowed. It could be thin as sorrow or thick as mortar. It could simmer for hours, accepting small additions and feeding many from little. There was dignity in pottage. It represented knowledge of proportion and patience. A cook knew when to add hard peas so they softened, when to stir to prevent burning, when to use salt, when to save salt, when a bone had given all it could, when a handful of oats might thicken the whole pot. The pot was not only cooking food, it was negotiating scarcity. Salt was essential. Without salt, meat spoiled quickly, fish rotted, cheese failed, and winter stores became uncertain. Salt preserved life by resisting decay. Yet salt itself could be expensive, taxed, traded, transported, and guarded. To waste salt was foolish. To lack salt was dangerous. Salted meat and fish could be harsh on the tongue, thirst making itself known after every bite. But the sharpness meant preservation had succeeded. Meat in winter varied enormously by class and circumstance. Wealthy households could consume beef, pork, mutton, game, poultry, fish, and rich sauces in quantities unimaginable to the poor. Monastic and aristocratic kitchens produced feasts that filled halls with smell and steam. But for many families, meat was occasional, stretched, salted, smoked, or used as flavour more than substance. A strip of bacon could season a pot, a bone could enrich broth. Fat could make vegetables satisfying. Meat was not always a portion on a plate. It was often a memory dissolved into liquid. Fat mattered intensely. Modern abundance has made many forget that fat is warmth, energy, and satiety. Lard, dripping, butter, cheese, marrow, suet, and oily fish could help the body withstand cold. A lean winter diet left people craving heaviness. Fat softened bread, enriched pottage, fried cakes, protected pans, and carried flavour. To have fat in store was to possess hidden fire for the body. Dairy followed the rhythms of animals. Milk was more abundant in some seasons than others, depending on calving, fodder, and survival of livestock. Fresh milk could be difficult to rely on through deep winter, but cheese and butter preserved the animal's gift. Cheese could be hard, salty, aged, and durable. It travelled well into the cold months. Even a small piece could change a meal from mere filling to nourishment. Fish played an important role, especially in communities near rivers, coasts, lakes, or trade routes, and in religious calendars where fasting shaped consumption. Salt fish, dried fish, smoked fish, herring, eel, cod, and local catches could appear according to region and means. Fish was not simply an alternative to meat. It was a lifeline where waters remained productive or commerce delivered preserved food inland. Yet ice, storms, and cost could limit access. Vegetables in winter were hardy, stored, dried, or humble. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, peas, beans, turnips, parsnips, and other roots gave substance and flavour. Garden produce was not a decorative supplement. It was essential. Women, children, and older family members often helped maintain gardens, and these small plots could soften the blows of bad grain years. A few leeks in a pot could make hunger feel less empty. An onion could perfume a whole room. Fruit was a treasure when kept. Apples, pears, medlars, dried berries, and nuts extended sweetness into the dark months. Honey, where available, was precious. Sugar, in much of medieval Europe for much of the period, remained costly and far beyond everyday use for the poor. Sweetness therefore carried rarity. A child given a dried apple slice in winter received more than food. They received a small reminder that warmth had once lived in the orchard. Drink mattered as much as food. Ale and small beer were common in many regions, not as luxury but as daily nourishment and safer liquid where water quality was uncertain. Brewing transformed grain into calories that could be swallowed by children and adults alike, though strength varied greatly. Cider, wine, milk, whey. And water belonged to local conditions and status. A warm drink in winter could become comfort beyond measure. Hands wrapped around a cup while smoke gathered overhead. Food storage was a constant anxiety. Grain could be kept in chests, bins or sacks, lofts, or pits depending on place and custom. Meat hung from beams, cheese rested on boards, roots lay buried under earth, straw, or sand. Apples were laid apart so one rotten fruit did not spoil the rest. Herbs dried in bunches, but vermin, damp, thieves, Insects, mould, and accidental spoilage threatened everything. Food was never safe simply because it had been gathered. It had to be watched. Rats and mice were winter rivals. They entered walls, floors, thatch, and stores. Cats had value because they hunted. Traps, tight containers, raised platforms, and constant vigilance helped, but nothing guaranteed protection. A family might wake to discover gnaw marks in a sack or droppings near meal. The loss of grain to vermin was not irritation. It was the theft of future meals. Famine was the terror beyond ordinary hunger, crop failure, war, livestock disease, flood, drought, frost, market disruption, and heavy taxation could turn hardship into catastrophe. In famine, people ate seed grain, guaranteeing future danger. They slaughtered animals needed for work. They stripped hedges, gathered wild plants, ground inferior substances into meal, begged, migrated, stole, or died. Written records sometimes speak in broad terms of dearth and mortality, but the household experience was intimate. It was the sound of the pot not boiling. Yet even in hard times, medieval people were not passive victims. They possessed strategies, they rationed, they shared among kin, they borrowed grain, they entered service, they sought alms from monasteries or churches, they foraged, they sold tools, cloth, animals, or future labour, they changed what they ate, they stretched meals with water, bran, herbs, and roots. They endured monotony because monotony kept bodies alive. Meals also carried emotion. The table, however rough, was where rank within the household appeared. The labourer who needed strength might receive a larger portion. The child might receive softness. The elder might be urged to eat. The nursing mother might require more if stores allowed. Such decisions were not always gentle. Scarcity could sharpen resentment. But food distribution was one of the ways a family expressed its priorities, fears, and affections. Festive meals interrupted the grey pattern when possible. A holy day, a wedding, a successful slaughter, a neighbour's brewing, or a seasonal custom could bring better food, more ale, and a brief lifting of spirits. These moments mattered because winter food was often repetitive. Celebration placed colour against dullness. It reminded people that survival was not only the avoidance of death, but the preservation of human feeling. The smell of medieval winter food was thick and close. Smoke, boiling peas, wet wool, sour ale, salt pork, onions softening in fat, rye bread, cheese, ash, herbs crushed between fingers. A pot simmering slowly in the half-dark could make a poor house feel briefly ordered. The spoon entered, lifted, cooled, and was passed. Mouths quieted. The body accepted what the season allowed. Hunger shaped dreams. People dreamed of white bread, roasted meat, butter, apples, warm milk, thick ale, pies, and feasts in halls beyond their station. They also feared the shame of begging, the grief of watching children weaken, the humiliation of debt, and the cold knowledge that stored food could run out while winter remained. To survive the cold, families needed more than shelter and flame. They needed food that could wait in the dark without rotting. They needed grain dry enough, meat salted enough, roots hidden well enough, and discipline stern enough to make stores last. The medieval winter table was therefore a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of bowls, loaves, sacks, salt, and silence. And in that silence, with the wind outside and the pot between them, families learned the oldest winter lesson of all. Warmth begins in the stomach. Hope can be measured in bread. Animals under the same roof. In medieval winter, animals were not scenery. They were wealth with breath in its nostrils. They were milk, wool, eggs, meat, traction, manure, leather, bone, horn, warmth, status, debt, and danger. A household might own few possessions that mattered more than a cow, a pig, a pair of oxen, a few sheep, hens scratching in filth, or a small goat nosing at the door. In the cold months, the survival of human beings and the survival of animals became tightly bound together, each depending on the other in a hard and ancient bargain. The modern idea of a clean division between house and barn did not always apply. In many regions and among poorer families, animals could be kept close to human living space, sometimes in the same building, sometimes in a lower byre, sometimes behind a partition, sometimes in a lean-to pressed against the wall. The arrangement was not accidental ignorance. It answered practical need. Animals needed shelter from freezing rain, wolves, theft, sickness, and wind. Humans benefited from the heat of animal bodies, from the convenience of care, and from the protection of their most valuable living property. A cow breathing in the darkness could warm the air around her. An ox shifting its weight gave off steady heat. Sheep crowded together made a dense living cloud of wool and breath. Pigs, restless and strong, generated warmth and smell in equal measure. Chickens might be kept close enough to prevent foxes, cold, or hunger from taking them. The house became not only a human dwelling, but an ark of winter survival. The price was filth, dung steamed in the cold, urine-soaked straw, fleas, lice, flies in milder spells, mites, worms, and disease lived in the intimate exchange between bodies. The smell could be overwhelming. Animal breath, wet hide, manure, sour bedding, smoke, human sweat, and boiled food mingled beneath the roof. To us it may seem unbearable, but to those who lived there, the scent was also information. They knew when an animal was ill by smell. They knew when bedding had turned foul. They knew when milk soured, when a pig pen needed scraping, when a cow's breath changed, when rot had entered straw. Winter animal care began with fodder. Grass was gone or hidden beneath frost. Fields were bare, wet, frozen, or forbidden. The animals that lived had to eat what people had stored for them. Hay was therefore one of the quiet foundations of survival. Meadows had been cut, dried, turned, gathered, and stacked in warmer months. And now that work returned as life, each armful of hay given to an animal represented past labour and future hope. But fodder was never simple. Hay could mould if stored damp. A stack could be ruined by rain. Mice nested in it. A roof leak could spoil it. Too little hay meant animals weakened before spring. Weak animals gave less milk, pulled poorly, became sick more easily, and sometimes died when they were most needed. The medieval family measured animal feed with the same anxiety used for human grain. Every mouth in the household, human or animal, consumed the winter store. The hard question was which animals to keep alive. Not every creature could be carried through winter. A pig might be fattened in autumn on mast, scraps, and waste, then slaughtered before fodder became too costly. Sheep might be reduced to a breeding core. Old hens might become broth. A weak calf might not be worth feeding if the household stood near hunger. These decisions were emotional, but they were also economic. Sentiment could not fill a manger. The animals spared for winter were those with future value. A cow that could calve and give milk, ewes that could lamb, hens that could lay when the light returned, oxen strong enough to pull the plough, a breeding sow, a good ram. These were not merely animals. They were next year's labour, next year's food, next year's rent, next year's chance. Cows held special importance. Milk could become butter, cheese, curds, whey, and nourishment for children. Yet winter milk was not guaranteed. A cow's yield depended on breed, health, feed, calving, and conditions. A poorly fed cow might dry up. A sick cow might die suddenly, taking with her not only food but standing in the village economy. A family that lost a cow could fall into debt, service, dependence, or desperation. The death of livestock could rearrange human fate. Oxen were engines of agriculture. Their strength broke soil, pulled carts, and made heavy labour possible. To keep oxen alive through winter was to protect the ploughing season. Their feed was an investment in future grain. When fodder ran low, the household faced a brutal calculation: feed the working beast and reduce food for others, or weaken the animal and imperil the fields. Medieval survival often required thinking in seasons rather than days. The hungry child at the table and the ox in the stall both belonged to the same chain of consequence. Sheep offered wool, meat, milk in some regions, skins, and manure. Wool was especially important, for it clothed the cold body and could be sold or used in household production. Sheep were hardy but not invincible. Wet cold could be deadly. Foot rot, parasites, poor grazing, and predators threatened them. Lambing at the wrong time could expose newborns to lethal weather. A shepherd's winter knowledge was written in vigilance, watching posture, movement, appetite, hooves, breath, and flock behaviour. Pigs were converters of waste into flesh. They ate scraps, must, roots, refuse, and what other animals might not. In autumn, woodland feeding could fatten them where rights allowed. By winter, many were slaughtered, turning into bacon, hams, sausages, lard, blood puddings, and salted cuts. A pig's death was an event of abundance tinged with necessity. Its body entered the household in pieces, each piece assigned a purpose. The pig did not simply feed the family once, it lengthened the season. Hens were small treasures. Eggs gave protein and could be traded or eaten, though laying often decreased in the dark months. Chickens were vulnerable to cold, foxes, weasels, dogs, theft, and hunger. They scratched near doors, roosted under shelter, and consumed scraps. A few eggs in winter could feel like a miracle of softness and nourishment. Even shells and feathers had uses. A poor household learned the value of small things. Goats, where kept, were nimble, hardy, and useful. Though capable of damage in gardens and hedges, they could provide milk, meat, skins, and browsing ability. Geese and ducks belonged to wetter places, bringing eggs, meat, feathers, and noise. Bees, though quiet in winter, represented honey and wax if the household or community kept them. Every species carried its own demands, gifts, and risks. Manure linked animal survival to agricultural survival. Dung was not waste alone, it was fertility. The bedding trampled beneath hooves and mixed with manure could be taken to fields, gardens, and plots, returning strength to the soil. In winter, animals concentrated dung indoors or near shelters, creating the future richness of the land. The smell of the byre was therefore also the smell of next year's crop. Medieval people understood this cycle deeply. The animal ate the field. The animal fed the field, and the field fed the household. Dung could also help with warmth in unexpected ways. Deep bedding systems, where straw and manure accumulated, could generate heat through decay. This was not always clean, but it could make animal quarters warmer. In some places, dried dung served as fuel. The boundary between filth and resource was drawn not by disgust, but by usefulness. Illness among animals was frightening because remedies were limited and losses were severe. A swollen udder, a lame ox, a coughing horse, a sheep that stopped eating, a pig with fever, all could send worry through the household. Medieval veterinary knowledge existed in practical oral monastic roads in written forms. but ordinary families often relied on experience, charms, herbs, bleeding, salves, prayer and observation. Some treatments helped, some did not. Only time revealed which creature would rise again and which would stiffen in the straw. Predators and thieves added another layer of winter anxiety. Wolves, where present, grew bolder in hard weather. Foxes took poultry. Dogs could worry sheep. Human hunger could turn into theft. A valuable animal might be hidden, watched, marked, or brought close to the sleeping place. To lose livestock in winter was to lose stored labour in a single night. Children grew up among animals not as pets in the modern sense, but as companions in labour and necessity. They carried feed, collected eggs, cleaned bedding, led geese, watched sheep, warmed small animals near the hearth, and learned caution around horns, hooves, teeth, and temper. They knew the personalities of beasts, the cow that kicked, the hen that laid in a hidden place, the pig that broke through fencing, the old ewe that followed a certain voice. Love could exist, but it existed beside butchery. Medieval children learned early that affection did not always prevent slaughter. Women's work often included milking, dairying, poultry care, feeding, bedding, and the transformation of animal products into household survival. Milk had to be strained, warmed, churned, curdled, pressed, salted, stored, guarded. Feathers could be saved, wool could be sorted, fat could be rendered, bones could be boiled, skins could be prepared or traded. The animal entered domestic labour long after it left the field or stall. The wealthy experienced animals differently, yet dependency remained. Great estates required horses, oxen, cattle, sheep, pigs, poultry, hunting dogs, falcons, and specialised servants, stables, barns, kennels, dovecotes, fish ponds, and deer parks all formed part of elite winter management. Horses especially demanded costly care. War horses, riding horses, pack horses, and cart horses needed feed, shelter, grooming, and protection. A castle or manor could consume vast stores to maintain its animal world. For the poor, the animal was nearer, smellier, more intimate and more fragile. A single cow might be named not out of sentiment alone, but because her identity mattered, her habits mattered, her milk mattered, her calf mattered. Her death would be remembered for years. In the coldest nights, the shared house of humans and animals made a strange community. The family heard chewing in the dark. A hoof knocked wood, a hen rustled, a cow exhaled. The pig dreamed in straw. The child turned beneath a cloak. Outside, frost silvered the world, but inside the room and byre, breath rose from many mouths. This closeness was not picturesque. It was harsh, unsanitary, noisy, and necessary. Yet it reveals something central about medieval survival. Families did not stand alone against winter. They survived within a web of living bodies, some human, some animal, all bound to soil, fodder, labour, warmth, and hunger. The household was not only a group of people. It was a small winter kingdom of breath, dung, wool, milk, bone, and fire, guarded fiercely because every living creature beneath the roof carried a portion of the future. Children in the season of death. Winter found children first. It found them in their fingers, in their thin wrists, in the cough that began softly and then settled deeper, in the blue shadow beneath tired eyes, in the way a small body curled toward warmth even while sleeping. Medieval childhood was not a sheltered garden set apart from hardship. It was lived close to fire, animals, illness, work, hunger, fear, prayer, and death. The child belonged to the household economy almost from the moment strength appeared in the limbs. To be born in the cold months was to enter the world at a dangerous hour. Childbirth itself was perilous at any season, but winter added its own cruelties. A mother laboured in a room that might be smoky, dim, crowded, and cold beyond the reach of the hearth. Water had to be heated, cloths had to be made ready. Women of the household or village gathered if they could. A midwife, where available, brought practical knowledge passed through experience, memory, and repetition. But the baby arrived naked into a season that punished nakedness instantly. The first task was warmth. A newborn had to be dried, wrapped, held, and kept close. Swaddling was not merely a custom of order and restraint, it also created warmth and security, binding the infant in layers when small limbs could not yet defend themselves from the air. The child might be placed near the mother, near the fire, or in a cradle where bedding could be arranged carefully. Yet too much closeness to smoke harmed the lungs. Too much distance from heat chilled the blood. Every placement was a compromise. Infant mortality was a constant shadow. Medieval parents were not less loving because death was common. That old assumption is one of the colder mistakes of modern imagination. The records of gifts, prayers, burial care, miracle stories, and family memory show grief deep enough to survive parchment and stone. Parents loved children in a world that offered no guarantee of keeping them. Love did not require safety. Often it grew under the pressure of danger. The winter baby faced many threats: weak feeding, fever, infection, smoke-filled air, chilled bedding, damp cloth, poor milk if the mother was undernourished, contaminated water, respiratory illness, sudden cold. The child's cry was not simply a sound of need, but a signal by which the household measured life. A quiet infant could bring more fear than a loud one. Older children were more resilient, but not safe. Their bodies required food to grow, yet winter food was often monotonous and limited. A child who lacked enough fat, protein, and warmth could become listless. Growth might slow, illness might linger, sores might heal poorly. The belly could swell from hunger or parasites. A cough could become a season-long companion. The most ordinary winter illnesses were also among the most frightening. Coughs, colds, fevers, sore throats, ear infections, lung infections, stomach troubles, skin infections, and parasites moved through crowded homes. Children slept close together. They shared cups, bowls, bedding, lice, warmth, and breath. Smoke irritated the lungs. Dampness chilled the body. Fleas and lice tormented the skin. A child scratching in the night was part of the winter soundscape. Medieval medicine for children mixed practical care, herbal knowledge, household remedies, religious hope, and inherited belief. Warm drinks, broths, poultices, honey where available, herbs, rest near the fire, rubbing, wrapping, prayer, charms, saints, relics, and blessings might all be used. Some remedies soothed, some had genuine value, some did little beyond giving frightened adults something to do. But doing something mattered. A family did not watch a sick child passively if there was any possible action left. The church stood near childhood from the beginning. Baptism carried urgency because infant death was so familiar. A child's soul was not an abstraction to medieval parents. It was bound to fear, faith, and the desperate need for spiritual protection. In winter, when travel was harder and roads were dangerous, reaching a church could itself be an ordeal. Yet baptism mattered enough to bring families through cold, mud, wind, and darkness. Children were also workers. A small child might tend the fire under supervision, gather kindling, carry water in small vessels, feed hens, watch younger siblings, hold yarn, sort beans, scare birds, collect eggs, bring tools, clean small spaces, or help with animals. As strength increased, so did obligation. Childhood was not without play, but play lived among chores, not apart from them. Snow could delight, but snow also blocked paths. Ice could amuse, but ice also broke bones and drowned the careless. A frozen pond was wonder and death in the same shining surface. Winter games existed because children will make play even in hardship. They slid on ice, through snow, carved small toys, played with bones, sticks, cloth scraps, stones, nuts, and imagination. They listened to stories by firelight, learned songs, teased one another, watched shadows, and absorbed the moral universe of their elders. A child in a medieval winter did not live only in misery. There were moments of laughter when the pot was full enough, when the fire burned clear, when an older sibling made a face in the glow, when a dog shook snow from its back and sent everyone shouting. Yet fear taught early discipline. Children learned not to waste fuel by leaving doors open. They learned not to step too near the hearth. They learned not to soak their only shoes. They learned the danger of wandering after dark. They learned that crying for more food did not make more food appear. They learned which adult could be asked for comfort and which one carried too much worry. They learned silence, not because silence was natural to childhood, but because winter households had moments when silence preserved peace. The emotional life of children in such conditions is difficult to recover, answerless, adrift to ponder. They did not leave diaries in the numbers we would wish. Their voices come to us through adult records, legal disputes, miracle collections, household accounts, skeletal remains, toys found in excavations, small shoes, tiny buckles, feeden vessels, and burials. Archaeology gives glimpses of young lives, often heartbreakingly brief. Bones can show malnutrition, disease, injury, growth interruption, and labour stress. Burial placement can suggest care, objects can suggest affection. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. A child's winter clothing was a continual problem. Sleeves too short, hose patched at the knee, shoes passed down and badly fitting, hoods tied under the chin, little hands wrapped in cloth, infants bound and layered, older children wrapped in adult cast-offs cut down to size. Mothers and older sisters mended constantly, not to preserve appearance, but to prevent cold from reaching skin. A child wet from snow or rain returned as a small emergency. The cloak had to be dried. The feet had to be warmed. The child might be scolded sharply, because wet clothing threatened the entire household rhythm. Drying required fire. Fire required fuel. Fuel required labour. A careless splash could become a chain of consequences. What seems like harshness may often have been fear speaking in a hard voice. Food revealed family tenderness and family strain. A parent might give the softest bread to the youngest. An older sibling might steal a crust. A grandmother might pretend to dislike a piece of cheese so a child would eat it. Or a hungry household might become tense and unequal, with strong workers fed first because their labour protected all. Medieval families were human, not ideal. Love, resentment, sacrifice, impatience, and fear sat at the same table. For children without parents, winter could be merciless. Orphans, foundlings, abandoned children, servants far from home, and the children of the very poor depended on charity, kin, employers, parish structures, monasteries, hospitals, or chance. Some were taken in, some were exploited, some entered service early, some vanished from the record. A child alone in winter stood at the edge of every danger at once. Servant children and apprentices faced another world of winter labour. They might sleep in workshops, kitchens, lofts, barns, or corners of another family's house. Their warmth depended on the generosity and resources of others. They rose early, carried burdens, ran errands, cleaned, watched fires, fetched goods, and learned trades in cold hands and dim light. Apprenticeship could offer future security, but it did not remove present hardship. In towns, children encountered cold differently. They moved through narrow streets slick with refuse and ice. They worked in shops, helped at market stalls, carried messages, begged, scavenged, or played in alleys where smoke from many hearths gathered under low skies. Urban winter offered more people, more trade, more charity in some places, but also more disease. Crowding made illness travel quickly. Poverty stood in public view. Rural children knew distance and weather with their feet. A child sent across fields in winter learned the geography of frozen ruts, hedges, ditches, woods, and streams. They knew where the wind struck hardest. They knew which path flooded. They knew how far a voice carried in frost. Their world was smaller than ours in miles, perhaps, but immense in texture. Death, when it came, entered the household without ceremony at first. The sick child grew quiet. The family watched. Breath changed. The fire kept burning. Outside, the cold continued without pity. Burial in winter could be hard if the ground froze. Grief had to move within the demands of work. The living still needed food. Animals still needed feeding. Water still had to be fetched. Medieval sorrow was often given no long, empty room in which to unfold. It had to stand beside labour. Yet mourning was real. A small grave, a prayer, a token, a remembered name, a mother's silence, a father's changed face, a sibling's confusion. These belonged to the medieval winter as surely as frost. The dead child did not become meaningless because many children died. Each absence altered the shape of the room. Those who survived winter emerged changed. A child who reached spring had crossed a trial of cold, smoke, limited food, illness, and discipline. Each year of survival added knowledge: how to dress, how to carry embers, how to avoid ice, how to read adult worry, how to make a toy from nothing, how to sleep through wind, how to endure hunger until the next meal, how to live close to death without surrendering to it. This is one of the hardest truths of medieval life. Children were fragile, but they were not weak in spirit. They belonged to families that needed them, loved them, worked them, protected them when possible, and sometimes failed to save them. Their winters were filled with coughs and chores, lullabies and smoke, fear and games, prayer and hunger, small hands held toward the fire. In that dim room, a child's face catching the light was more than a private joy. It was the future made visible, and every winter asked whether that future would remain. Women, labour and winter endurance. In the cold heart of the medieval household, survival often moved through women's hands, not always loudly, not always with recognition, not always in the language of chronicles, which preferred kings, bishops, wars, charters, and the bright violence of public deeds. Yet in the winter room, where smoke blurred the rafters and frost pressed against the shutters, women's labour held the structure of life together. The family endured not only because fields had been harvested or animals had been sheltered, but because someone cooked, mended, nursed, spun, brewed, cleaned, measured, soothed, remembered, and began again before dawn. The work was continuous. A medieval woman's winter day did not begin with the luxury of deciding what should be done. Necessity had already written the list. The fire had to be stirred or remade. Water had to be fetched or melted. The pot had to be set to heat. Children had to be fed, washed if possible, wrapped, scolded, comforted, and sent to useful tasks. Animals needed attention. Bedding needed shaking. Ashes needed managing. Cloth needed drying. Food stores needed checking, tools, clothing, shoes, sacks, and household goods needed repair. Winter did not reduce labour, it changed its shape. In warmer months, women worked in fields, gardens, dairies, markets, brewhouses, kitchens, and households, their labour woven through the agricultural year. In winter, more work gathered indoors, but indoor did not mean easy. The house became a place of production. It was kitchen, nursery, workshop, storehouse, sick room, and sometimes byre. The cold did not excuse idleness, it demanded skill. Spinning was one of the great winter labours. Wool, flax, and other fibres had to be transformed into thread before they could become cloth. The distaff and spindle were familiar companions, so closely associated with women that they became symbols of female work itself. The motion was repetitive, but not mindless. Fingers drew fibre evenly. The spindle turned, thread formed, too thick, and the yarn wasted material. Too thin, and it broke. Skill lay in consistency, patience, and touch. This work could continue while watching children, listening to stories, minding a pot, or sitting near the hearth. It was portable labour, but it was also endless. Cloth did not appear quickly. A single garment represented hours upon hours of preparation before weaving even began. To clothe a family against winter, women's hands had to turn animal fleece and plant fibre into a second skin for human survival. Mending was equally essential. A torn sleeve meant cold air on the arm, a split seam meant lost warmth, a hole in hose meant pain, a frayed blanket meant weaker sleep. Women patched garments with whatever cloth remained. They cut old garments into pieces, turned worn fabric, reinforced elbows, darned stockings, adjusted children's clothing, and preserved every useful scrap. The needle defended the body as surely as a wall defended the house. Brewing was another pillar of household endurance. In many medieval communities, ale was a daily necessity, and women often played a central role in producing it for family use or sale. Brewing required grain, water, heat, vessels, timing, and judgment. The mash had to be managed, fermentation had to be watched, weak drink, stronger ale, spoiled batches, souring, and household demand all belonged to the brewer's world. Ale fed the body, warmed the spirit, and sometimes brought needed income. A woman who brewed well held valuable knowledge. She knew the smell of success and failure. She knew how cold affected fermentation. She knew how much grain could be spared. She knew whether the household needed nourishment, trade, hospitality, or caution. In a winter economy where every resource mattered, brewing was not a cheerful hobby. It was domestic chemistry tied to survival. Cooking demanded the same subtle intelligence. A medieval cook working with limited winter stores had to create fullness from scarcity. The question was not what one desired, but what could be made from what remained. A handful of peas, a crust of bread, an onion, a little fat, a bone, a pinch of salt, a bruised apple, a scoop of meal. The pot became a site of judgment. Too much used today could create hunger tomorrow. Too little could leave workers weak, thickening a broth, stretching a stew, softening stale bread, hiding bitterness with herbs, making poor food acceptable to tired mouths. These were arts of endurance. Women also guarded food from waste. They knew which cheese must be eaten first, which roots were softening, which apples had begun to rot, which sack smelled damp, which child had taken an extra piece, which animal might need a little more feed to live. This knowledge did not always sit in written accounts, but it lived in memory and observation. Winter survival required attention to small changes. A woman who noticed early could save what another might lose. Nursing made women central to the struggle against winter illness. They cared for fevered children, coughing elders, injured workers, women after childbirth, and men weakened by labour. Nursing meant warming broth, changing cloths, cleaning vomit, rubbing cold limbs, sitting through broken sleep, watching breath, murmuring prayers, and deciding whether a person was improving or fading. It was emotional labour as much as physical labour, performed under conditions of fatigue. A mother might nurse an infant while stirring a pot with one hand. She might lie awake listening to a child's breathing. She might give warmth from her own body to someone smaller and weaker. She might rise before light after a night without rest because the household did not pause for exhaustion. Winter made sleep a contested treasure, and women often lost the contest. Childbirth placed women in particular danger. A pregnant woman entered winter with increased need for food, warmth, and help. But her household might have little extra to give. Labour could begin in darkness, during storm, in a house already strained by hunger or illness. The women who attended birth carried practical knowledge, but danger remained. The room of birth could become a room of joy, fear, blood, prayer, and sudden mourning. A living mother and living child were never taken for granted. Widows faced winter with special vulnerability and special authority. A widow might control certain property, manage a household, continue a trade, brew, sell, rent, negotiate, and raise children. In some towns and villages, widows could be formidable economic actors. Yet poverty could also close around them quickly, without adult male labour, without secure rights, without kin, or with young children to feed. Winter became a test of legal standing and social support. The widow's hearth revealed whether custom protected her or abandoned her. Women's labour extended into the community. They shared childbirth knowledge, exchanged food, lent tools, helped with washing, watched children, prepared bodies for burial, carried news, attended church, and participated in seasonal customs. A village woman didn't live only inside her own walls. Her reputation mattered, her kinship ties mattered, her skill mattered. In winter, a woman known to be generous, capable, or experienced could become a quiet centre of communal survival. Yet women also endured scrutiny. A failed brew, a suspected theft, a quarrel at the well, a dispute over gleaning, a rumour of immorality, a conflict over debts or inheritance. All could attach themselves to female lives in damaging ways. Medieval communities were intimate enough to support and intimate enough to watch. A woman's winter work might be indispensable, yet her social position remained shaped by law, custom, marriage, property, age, and reputation. The work of washing in winter deserves its own silence. Cold water bit the hands. Linen had to be scrubbed, beaten, rinsed, wrung, and dried. Heavy cloth resisted drying. Infants and the sick created more soiled fabric. Water might be carried from a frozen source. Fingers cracked, skin reddened. The steam from warmed water vanished quickly into the room. Cleanliness existed, but it demanded pain, time, and fuel. Women's hands showed winter. They became rough, swollen, chapped, burned by cooking, pricked by needles, reddened by washing, darkened by smoke, scratched by animals, and stiff from cold. Rings, where worn, didn't soften the labour beneath them. Hands carried the evidence of an entire household's needs. In towns, women's winter labour could include trade and craft production. They worked as brewers, bakers, textile workers, market sellers, servants, laundresses, midwives, healers, shopkeepers, spinners, and assistants in family workshops. A woman might rise in the cold to prepare goods for market, stand in freezing air selling bread or ale, carry baskets through filthy streets, or work by dim light on cloth that would be sold to someone warmer than herself. Urban opportunity and urban hardship walked side by side. In elite households, noble women faced a different winter, but not an idle one. They supervised servants, stores, clothing, hospitality, religious obligations, estates, children, marriages, correspondence, and sometimes defence or administration in the absence of men, tapestries, fur linings, better food, and larger fires softened the cold, but responsibility remained. A great household could devour supplies at astonishing speed. To manage it required authority and calculation. The spiritual life of women also shaped winter endurance. Prayers, saints, fasts, feasts, candles, confession, and church attendance framed suffering within meaning. A woman might pray for a sick child, for safe childbirth, for food, for the return of a husband, for protection against storm, for mercy upon the dead. Faith did not remove labour. It gave labour a cosmic witness. In the dimness of winter, the smallest candle could suggest that the household was not abandoned to darkness entirely. There was tenderness, too. A mother warming a child's feet beneath her skirt, a grandmother telling a story while spinning, sisters sharing a blanket, a wife saving the best morsel for a husband whose strength was needed at dawn, a neighbour bringing broth to a lying-in woman, a midwife placing a newborn against warm skin. These gestures were not sentimental decorations on hardship. They were part of the machinery of survival, and yet none of this should make medieval women into saints carved from patience. They were human. They grew angry. They complained. They bargained. They laughed. They envied. They disciplined children sharply. They quarrelled with husbands, neighbours, servants, mothers-in-law, and authorities. Winter crowded people together, and crowded lives could spark conflict. Endurance was not always graceful. Sometimes it was simply continuing while irritated, frightened, tired, and cold. What makes this labour so powerful is its repetition. Not one heroic act, but thousands of small acts. A pot lifted, a thread spun, a child wrapped, a sleeve mended, a fever watched, a loaf divided, a fire coaxed, a tub scrubbed, a prayer spoken, a store checked, a body buried, a morning begun again. The medieval winter household survived because domestic labour transformed scarcity into continuity. Women did not merely help families endure the cold. In countless homes, they organised the terms of endurance. Their work was the hidden architecture beneath the visible walls, the warm pulse beneath the smoke, the disciplined intelligence that kept hunger, cold, dirt, illness, and despair from overwhelming the room all at once. If we listen closely to the winter house, beneath the crackle of fire and the breathing of animals, we can hear it. The spindle turning, the knife chopping, the baby stirring, the pot being scraped, the needle passing through worn wool, the quiet voice counting what remains. And in that sound the family continues. Lord's tithes and frozen fields. Winter did not fall equally upon every roof. The snow might whiten the manor house and the cottage in the same night. The frost might silver the same hedges. The same wind might cross the same fields. But the season did not visit all people with the same severity. Wealth could not abolish cold, but it could soften its teeth. Land, stored grain, legal power, servants, animals, rents, and rights changed the meaning of winter. For the poor, the season was endured with calculation and fear. For the powerful, it was managed through command. At the centre of much medieval rural life stood the manor, not merely as a building, but as a system. It was a web of obligations binding landholders, tenants, labourers, lord, steward, reeve, bailiff, priest, and village custom into a single local order. The fields surrounding a settlement were not simply open earth. They were divided by rights, duties, strips, common practices, payments, and memory. Every furrow had a history. Every obligation had weight. For a peasant family, winter hardship was shaped not only by weather, but by what had already been taken. Rents might be paid in money, grain, labour, livestock, poultry, eggs, or other dues. The church tithe claimed a portion for spiritual and institutional support. The Lord might demand services, fees, heriot at death, payments for marriage, milling dues, oven dues, or other customary rights depending on place and period. The exact arrangements varied widely, but the underlying truth remained. The household did not keep everything it produced. A stack of grain in the autumn might look like survival until the claims upon it were counted. Seed grain had to be saved for planting, rent had to be met, tithe had to be given, debts had to be answered, animals had to be fed, tools had to be maintained. The family had to eat. What began as abundance could shrink under obligation until the margin became thin enough to terrify. The tithe was rooted in the idea that a tenth belonged to God. Administered through the church, in practice, it could feel to the poor like another hand reaching into the store. Yet the church was not simply an extractor. It also provided ritual, charity, burial, feast days, spiritual order, and, in some places, aid to the poor. The village priest might know the hunger of his parishioners intimately. Monasteries and hospitals sometimes gave alms. Still, when grain was scarce, even sacred claims could become painful. The Lord's power was more worldly and more immediate. He might live nearby or be absent, represented by officials who measured fields, recorded dues, enforced rights, and guarded estate income. The manor court was a place where disputes were heard, fines imposed, customs affirmed, and local order maintained. For the peasant, law was not distant. It could arrive in the form of a demand, a penalty, a restriction on wood gathering, a fee for using the mill, or a judgment over land. Winter made these obligations sharper because work opportunities narrowed. A family with little money could not easily earn more once fields slept and roads worsened. Debts that seemed manageable in harvest light became heavier in cold darkness. A bad year might force borrowing. Borrowing might require pledging tools, animals, land rights, labour, or future crops. Poverty was not always a sudden fall. Often it was a slow tightening. The frozen field itself carried legal meaning. Open field agriculture in many regions required coordination. Strips were cultivated by different families, but planting, harvesting, grazing, and fallow use were governed by communal timing. Common rights might allow animals to graze after harvest, pigs to feed in woods, or villagers to gather certain resources. These rights were essential to winter survival. They were not generous extras. They formed part of the household economy. When such rights were restricted, enclosed, abused, or disputed, the poorest suffered first. A family without enough private land depended on access to common pasture, deadwood, gleaning, and seasonal resources. A lost right could mean less fodder, less fuel, fewer animals, thinner meals. Medieval documents sometimes make such matters sound dry, but behind them stood people calculating whether a child could be fed. Labour services where owed could intrude upon a family's own survival work. A tenant might be required to plough, reap, cart, repair, ditch, hedge, or perform other tasks for the Lord's domain. In winter, estate work might include carting wood, threshing grain, repairing buildings, tending animals, maintaining roads, or other labour suited to the season. Time given to the Lord was time not spent on one's own roof, tools, fields, fuel, or family. Yet the manor was not simply oppression in one direction. It could also provide structure, security, and access to resources that might otherwise be beyond reach. A lord's mill ground grain, a manor oven baked, a large estate stored seed, maintained breeding animals, supported craftsmen, organised labour, and sometimes offered employment or relief. In violent times, powerful households might provide protection. The relationship was unequal, but it was not always simple. Medieval life rarely obeys one moral shape. The steward or reeve became important figures in winter administration. They oversaw stores, animals, labour, repairs, and records. On a well-managed estate, winter was a season of accounting. How much grain remained? How many animals had survived? Which fields needed attention? Which tenants owed what? Which buildings leaked? Which woods could be cut? The lord's household watched resources on a larger scale, while the peasant household did the same in miniature. Taxation beyond the manor could deepen distress. Kings needed money for war, administration, ransom, marriages, and display. Extraordinary taxes, levies, forced loans, or purveyance could reach down into communities already strained by winter. War in particular was a devourer. Armies consumed grain, animals, carts, fodder, wood, and men. Even distant conflict could be felt in a village pot. When soldiers moved through the land, winter could become catastrophic. Foraging armies took food and fuel, horses needed feed, roads were damaged, stores were seized, houses were occupied or burned, refugees appeared, markets faltered. A medieval family could endure a natural winter and still be broken by human winter. The cold season made crueler by power, violence, and fear. Markets offered both hope and danger. A family with surplus could sell, a family with need could buy, if it had money. But winter prices could rise. Bad roads limited supply. Frozen rivers could halt transport or, in some cases, briefly improve movement where ice was safe. Town markets brought grain, salt fish, cloth, tools, and news. But they also revealed inequality. The poor looked upon goods they could not afford. Hunger was sharpened by visibility. Coin itself was unevenly present in rural life. Some obligations shifted over time from labour to cash, and this could help or harm depending on conditions. Money gave flexibility when wages were available and markets functioned. It became a trap when coins were demanded from those who had goods but little cash. A family might sell grain in order to pay rent, then later lack food. The market and the manor together could force impossible choices. The priest occupied a complicated position within this cold economy. He might be a spiritual guide, local mediator, record keeper, collector of tithes, educated man, and sometimes poor man himself. Parish life centred on sacraments, bells, feast days, burial, confession, and seasonal observance. The church calendar gave winter meaning, but the church building itself could be bitterly cold. Stone floors, unheated spaces, and long services required endurance from bodies already chilled. For families, religious obligation was not separate from survival. Missing church could bring social or spiritual consequences. Giving alms, lighting candles, paying dues, observing fasts, and honouring saints all belong to the moral world of the village. A winter feast might require food when stores were guarded carefully. A funeral might demand payment when money was scarce. Faith comforted, but it also carried duties. Some lords gave winter charity. They might distribute food at gates, support the poor on holy days, feed tenants during crisis, or sponsor communal feasts. Such generosity displayed piety and power at once. A great hall feeding the needy could be mercy, theatre, obligation, and hierarchy in the same act. The poor received bread, but they also saw who had the authority to give it. Punishment could also be seasonal. A person caught stealing wood, grain, animals, or food in winter might not be acting from greed but desperation. Yet law still had its forms: fines, shame, corporal punishment, imprisonment, or exclusion could follow. Communities understood hunger, but they also feared disorder. A village could pity a thief and still punish theft, because everyone's store was vulnerable. Women, widows, landless labourers, servants, and the elderly were especially exposed to the machinery of obligation. A widow might struggle to defend her rights. A landless man might rely on day work that disappeared in bad weather. A servant might be fed but controlled. An elderly couple might depend on children, charity, or small holdings. Winter revealed where social bonds held and where they failed. The great inequality of medieval winter is most visible in firelight. In a manor hall, flames could roar beneath hanging cloths. Servants carried dishes, stored grain-filled barns. Ale flowed for guests. Hunting parties might return with meat. Musicians, chaplains, clerks, and retainers moved through spaces where hardship was present but buffered by command. In the cottage, the fire was smaller, fuel was counted, food was stretched, smoke hung low, repairs waited for materials. The family listened to the same church bell, owed dues to the same order, and prayed beneath the same winter sky. But their margin was narrower. Still, the poor were not merely crushed. They negotiated, resisted, delayed, petitioned, hid small stores, relied on kin, used custom as a shield, brought cases to manor courts, gathered secretly, shared burdens, and remembered injustice. Medieval peasants understood law and obligation in practical terms. They knew what was owed, what was excessive, what could be contested, what must be endured, and what might be quietly evaded. The frozen field therefore becomes more than landscape. It is a ledger. Beneath the frost lie strips of land tied to labour, boundaries tied to custom, paths tied to rights, woods tied to fuel, meadows tied to hay, churches tied to tithe, manor barns tied to rent. The cold earth holds the social order as firmly as it holds the roots of winter grain. To survive medieval winter, a family needed strength, food, clothing, shelter, and fuel. But it also needed position. It needed rights recognized by others. It needed access to land, wood, pasture, market, charity, and justice. Cold was natural. Vulnerability was social. The season did not merely ask whether the harvest had been good. It asked who controlled the harvest. It asked who had the right to take. It asked whose hunger counted. And across the frozen fields, beneath the watch of manor, church, and village, medieval families endured a winter made not only by weather, but by power. Disease in the dark months. Winter entered the medieval body through many doors. It came through the lungs with smoke and frozen air. It came through the belly with spoiled food and dirty water. It came through the skin with lice, fleas, sores, chilblains, and wounds that would not close. It came through exhaustion, through hunger, through childbirth, through damp bedding, through crowded rooms, through the long closeness of bodies gathered for warmth. Medieval winter was not merely a season of cold. It was a season when weakness collected, multiplied, and waited for the smallest opening. A cough could begin as nothing, a child breathing too near the hearth, an old man walking back from the byre in sleet, a woman carrying water in wet shoes, a labourer sweating through his tunic while hauling wood, then cooling too quickly in the wind. At first, there might be only a rough throat, a sniff, a night of restlessness. Then the cough deepened, the chest tightened, breath grew noisy, fever came, The household listened. Listening was medicine before medicine had a name. People heard the difference between a shallow cough and a dangerous one. They heard when a child's breathing became fast. They heard when sleep was no longer restful but troubled. They heard the rattle in an elder's chest. Medieval families might not have understood microbes, but they understood patterns. They knew which illnesses passed from person to person. They knew that dampness, cold, hunger, and foul air made sickness worse. They knew that a body already weakened by poor food might not return easily from fever. The winter house encouraged infection. Families slept close. Children shared bedding. Adults shared cups, bowls, spoons, cloaks, and air. Animals stood nearby in many homes. Smoke drifted low. Ventilation was limited because open shutters invited cold. The same efforts that preserved warmth could trap sickness. Breath hung in the room. Coughs moved from one mouth to another. The house protected the family from weather while sometimes imprisoning them with disease. Smoke was both companion and enemy. It warmed, cooked, dried, and preserved. Yet it also entered eyes and lungs day after day. In homes without efficient chimneys, smoke could fill the upper air and descend when wind shifted. Infants lying low, elders seated near the hearth, women cooking for long hours, and children gathered indoors all breathed what the fire gave. Chronic irritation made winter coughs harsher. Eyes reddened. Throats burned. Phlegm thickened. The comfort of the hearth was never without cost. Cold injuries also marked the season. Frostbite in severe conditions could damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. More commonly, people suffered chilblains, painful swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp. Skin reddened, itched, cracked, and burned. Feet in wet shoes, hands plunged into cold water, children playing in frost, servants running errands, shepherds standing in wind. All were vulnerable. A small crack in the skin could become infected. A sore could fester. Pain could make work slower, and slow work could endanger the household. Wounds healed badly in winter when bodies were underfed. A cut from chopping wood, a burn from the hearth, a bite from an animal, a blister from a tool, a cracked heel, a thorn in the foot, each carried risk. Without modern antibiotics, infection could turn ordinary injury into mortal danger. Redness spread, pus gathered, fever rose. A hand might swell until it could not grip. A foot wound could make walking impossible. The medieval body lived close to consequences. Parasites did not vanish because the air was cold. Lice flourished in clothing, seams, bedding, and hair, especially when washing was difficult and garments were worn continuously. Fleas lived where animals, straw, and human shared space. Worms and intestinal parasites troubled many people through contaminated food, water, soil, and close living. Itching, scratching, rashes, poor sleep, weakness, and belly pain formed part of ordinary bodily experience. The winter household was not only cold, it was inhabited by tiny hungers. Digestive illness could be devastating. Stored food might spoil in hidden ways. Grain could mould. Meat could be poorly preserved. Water sources could be contaminated. A thaw might foul streams with waste. Crowded living made hygiene difficult. Vomiting and diarrhea were dangerous because they drained strength quickly, especially from children and elders. A person weakened by dehydration and hunger could sink fast. Warm broth, rest, and care might help. But many households had little margin. Medieval healing drew from many worlds at once. Practical household medicine sat beside learned theory, religious ritual, charms, local plant knowledge, and the authority of experienced healers. A family might use herbs for coughs, salves for sores, compresses for swelling, honey for wounds if available, warm drinks for chills, steam, rubbing, binding, or careful feeding. They might call a village healer, consult a monk, visit a physician if wealthy enough, seek a barber surgeon, pray to a saint or hang hope upon a relic. This mixture should not be dismissed as foolishness. Medieval people observed carefully. Many remedies came from generations of trial, and some had real soothing or antiseptic value. Honey, certain herbs, warmth, rest, cleanliness where possible, and nutrition could all make a difference. Yet medieval medicine also worked within frameworks now abandoned. The balance of humours, bloodletting, purging, astrological timing, and symbolic correspondences shaped learned practice. Some interventions helped, some weakened the patient further. Still, to do nothing was almost unthinkable. The theory of humours described the body as governed by balances of qualities such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. Winter itself was understood as cold and wet in many learned traditions, a season that encouraged phlegmatic illnesses. Treatments might therefore seek to warm, dry, open, purge, or rebalance the body. Food, drink, herbs, bleeding, bathing, and regimen could all be chosen according to such ideas. Even when the theory was wrong by modern standards, it offered a language for observing illness and acting upon it. The poor rarely had access to elite physicians. Their medicine was domestic, communal, and practical. The mother who knew which plant soothed a cough, the old woman who prepared a poultice, the shepherd who understood an animal bite, the midwife who managed fever after birth, the priest who prayed over the sick, these formed the front line of winter care. Knowledge moved by voice, gesture, memory, and apprenticeship. Childbirth fever was a terrible danger. A woman who survived labour might still weaken afterward. Infection could creep in with blood. Unclean hands, retained tissue, exhaustion, or poor conditions. Fever, chills, pain, foul discharge, and delirium could follow. The household might wrap her, warm her, pray for her, feed her broth, burn herbs, call for help, and wait in dread. A mother's death in winter could fracture an entire family. An infant lost milk. Children lost care. Labour vanished. Grief entered the room and sat heavily by the fire. Mental suffering also belonged to winter, though medieval people described it differently than we do. Long darkness, confinement, hunger, grief, fear, debt, and illness pressed upon the mind. Some became irritable, some fell silent, some despaired. Religious language offered ways to understand sorrow, temptation, melancholy, trial, sin, and endurance. Community rituals, church bells, feast days, confession, storytelling, work, and prayer helped hold the mind within structure. Yet no society escapes the burden of darkness entirely. The sick bed was not always a bed. It might be straw near the hearth, a pallet, a cloak on the floor, a shared sleeping place, a bench, or the warmest corner available. The sick were placed where they could be watched and warmed. This meant the whole household lived with illness visibly present. A feverish body did not disappear behind a hospital curtain. It lay among the living, altering every movement. The pot was stirred quietly. Children were hushed. Fire was fed more carefully. Someone woke again and again to check breathing. Death could come slowly or suddenly. A fever might burn for days. A lung illness might tighten its grip across a week. A stomach sickness might take a child in a night. An old person might fade during a cold spell, sleeping longer, eating less, becoming lighter beneath the blanket. Medieval families recognized signs of approaching death. The priest might be called, confession, communion, anointing, prayers, candles, and final words gathered around the body if time allowed. The end of life was spiritual, social, and physical at once. Burial in winter added hardship to grief. Frozen ground resisted the spade. Snow-covered paths. Bodies had to be carried in cold air. The churchyard might be bleak beneath bare trees and grey sky. Yet burial mattered. To place the dead in consecrated ground. To speak prayers. To muck the loss. To return home to a smaller household. These acts formed part of survival for the living. Grief needed ritual because labour resumed too quickly. Epidemic disease could transform winter from hardship into horror. Plague, smallpox, influenza-like illnesses, dysentery, and other contagious threats moved through medieval populations at different times and places. Crowding, trade routes, war, malnutrition, and poor sanitation helped disease travel. A village might lose not one elder or one infant, but household after household. Bells tolled too often. Labour collapsed. Fields went untended. Fear changed how people looked at neighbours, strangers, priests and roads. Yet most winter sickness was not the spectacular catastrophe remembered by chroniclers. It was ordinary suffering, the cough that lasted a month, the child with worms, the woman with cracked hands, the old man with swollen joints, the servant with a burn, the baby with fever, the family half asleep because lice tormented them through the night. Such afflictions rarely made history books, but they shaped the daily reality of survival. Joint pain and old injuries worsened in cold, arthritis, poorly healed fractures, back strain, toothache, and chronic wounds became sharper when damp settled in. Medieval labour wore the body early. Knees bent over fields, shoulders carried loads, hands gripped tools, teeth cracked on gritty bread. By 40, many bodies had endured more hardship than modern comfort easily imagines. Winter made those histories ache. Tooth disease deserves its place in the dark months. Abscesses, decay, worn enamel, infected gums, and jaw pain could torment a person without relief. Smoke, cold, and hard food added misery. A bad tooth could swell the face, prevent eating, spread infection, and weaken the whole body. Extraction by a barber surgeon or tooth drawer might be the only solution, painful and risky. In winter, when food was already limited, being unable to chew could become life-threatening. Care depended on proximity. Families survived disease because someone stayed near the sick, even when fear whispered that closeness was dangerous. Someone wiped the mouth, someone changed bedding, someone lifted the head to drink, someone cleaned the floor, someone held the child, someone sat through the hour when breathing changed. This care exposed the caregiver to infection, exhaustion, and grief. Yet it was the foundation of household medicine. Religion offered not only hope for cure, but meaning when cure failed. Saints associated with particular illnesses, local shrines, holy water, blessed candles, masses, vows, pilgrimages, and prayers gave structure to desperation. A family might promise an offering if a child recovered. They might place trust in divine mercy when human remedies failed. Modern minds may separate medicine and faith. Medieval families often did not. They acted in both worlds because the body and soul were never strangers. Disease in medieval winter teaches a severe lesson. Cold itself was only one part of danger. The true enemy was the combination of cold, hunger, crowding, smoke, damp, labour, poor sanitation, and limited treatment. Each factor weakened the body's defences. Each made the next more deadly. A cough in a warm, well-fed person might pass. The same cough in a hungry child sleeping in smoke and damp could become fatal. Still, many recovered. Bodies are stubborn. Care matters. Warm broth matters. Rest matters. Dry clothing matters. A watched fever may break. A wound may close. A child may cough for weeks and then laugh again. an elder may rise slowly and return to the fire. Medieval families lived not only with death, but with repeated recoveries that must have seemed, in their own quiet way, miraculous. The dark months filled the house with fragile uncertainty. Every morning, the family assessed not only the weather, but the condition of bodies. Who coughed through the night? Who could stand? Who could work? Who needed more food? Who had fever? Who must be kept warm? The household was a small infirmary long before anyone named it so. In the end, winter disease was a test of bonds. The sick body revealed whether others would gather close or turn away. It demanded fuel, food, time, patience, and courage from people who had little to spare. It showed the terrible vulnerability of flesh in a world without modern protection. And yet, in the smoky half-light, someone still lifted the cup. Someone still warmed the cloth. Someone still whispered the prayer. Someone still waited beside the breath of the sick, listening for life to remain. Feast days against despair. In the long darkness of medieval winter, people needed more than food, fuel, clothing, and shelter. They needed reasons to continue. They needed bells in the cold air, candles in the church, songs in the throat, ale in the cup, holy days on the calendar, and stories strong enough to hold back despair for one more night. Winter was not only a physical ordeal, it was an assault upon the spirit. The light withdrew early. Work became cramped and repetitive. Hunger sharpened tempers. Illness moved from bed to bed. Roads grew difficult. The dead seemed nearer in the dark months, and the future could feel hidden under frost. In such a season, ritual mattered. It gave structure to fear. It told people that the turning year had meaning. It marked time not as an endless suffering, but as a road of appointed days, each carrying memory, obligation, and hope. The church calendar governed medieval winter with immense power. Advent prepared the soul. Christmas celebrated divine birth in the heart of darkness. The days that followed held saints, prayers, feasts, fasts, and customs layered over older seasonal instincts. Candlemas brought light into the cold stretch of the year. Lent, depending on the calendar, drew near as winter weakened, asking discipline from bodies already familiar with want. To modern eyes, feasting during scarcity may appear contradictory. Why use precious food when winter stores must be guarded? Yet this question misunderstands the emotional economy of survival. A feast was not mere indulgence. It was a social and spiritual instrument. It reminded the village that life was more than rationing. It renewed bonds. It honoured God and saints. It allowed the poor, at least briefly, to taste something richer than repetition. It gave memory a warm place to gather. A medieval Christmas in a great household could be a theatre of abundance. Fires burned high, tables filled with bread, meat, pies, puddings, fish, ale, wine, sauces, cheeses, and sweets where wealth allowed. The hall rang with voices, music, laughter, prayer, and ceremony. Lords displayed generosity, guests confirmed alliances. Servants laboured heavily behind the glow. The feast showed hierarchy even as it claimed fellowship. Those seated nearest honour were not the same as those who carried dishes through smoke and heat. In humbler homes, celebration might be modest but still meaningful. A better loaf, a little meat saved for the day, ale stronger than usual, a candle lit carefully, a song remembered, a neighbour invited, a child given a treat, a table wiped with unusual attention. The difference between ordinary pottage and feast day pottage could be small in ingredients yet immense in feeling. A spoonful of fat, an egg, a piece of bacon, a sweet apple, a bit of cheese. These could turn a winter meal into a marker of grace. Ritual transformed space. The same cold church that numbed feet on ordinary days could become luminous with candle flame. The smell of wax, damp stone, incense where used, wool cloaks, wet shoes, and human breath gathered beneath the roof. Voices rose in chant or song. The congregation stood shoulder to shoulder. Light trembled on painted images, carved wood, and altar cloth. For people who lived much of winter in smoky darkness, sacred light was not a metaphor only. It was a sensory event. It entered the eye as consolation. Candles had particular power. They were costly enough to matter and fragile enough to seem alive. A candle at a shrine, on an altar, near a sick bed, or in a household ceremony gave shape to prayer. Candlemas, with its blessing of candles, carried the promise of light through the remaining cold. A small flame could suggest that darkness was not sovereign. Even when the nights felt endless, music and storytelling were also survival tools. In a world where literacy was uneven and books were rare, memory carried entertainment, instruction, history, and wonder. Around winter fires, people told saints' lives, local legends, family tales, cautionary stories, comic episodes, ghostly accounts, romances, riddles, and fragments of heroic memory. A good storyteller could enlarge the room. Suddenly, the listeners were not only poor villagers beside a hearth, but travellers through forests, pilgrims on roads, kings in exile, lovers under enchantment, sinners warned, saints tested, fools exposed. Stories gave pattern to suffering. They taught that hardship could be endured, that pride could fall, that generosity mattered, that evil might disguise itself, that miracles could enter low places, that the dead might not be silent, that the weak might be protected by grace or cunning. In the winter dark, such stories did not merely pass time, they guarded the imagination. Games and communal play broke the weight of confinement. Dice, board games, singing games, rough sports, riddles, dancing, mock ceremonies, and seasonal misrule appeared in different forms across medieval communities. Authority sometimes worried about excess, gambling, disorder, drunkenness, or irreverence. But from the household point of view, laughter had value. A village that never laughed in winter might grow brittle. Play allowed tension to escape before it became violence. Alehouses and taverns, where present, formed another winter refuge. They were places of drink, news, gossip, warmth, negotiation, music, argument, and temptation. A person might come in from frozen streets, hands numb, cloak wet, and find firelight, voices, and the thick smell of ale for labourers, travellers, artisans, and villagers. Such places could be socially vital. They could also drain scarce coin, stir quarrels, and attract moral criticism. As always in medieval life, comfort carried risk. Communal charity found special importance in the holy season. Almsgiving, distributions of bread, leftovers from great tables, parish support, monastic hospitality, and gifts between neighbours could help the poor survive both materially and emotionally. To receive food was to receive calories, but also recognition. To give food was to enact piety and social duty. Winter charity did not erase inequality, yet for some families it may have meant another week of endurance, mumming, masking. And seasonal performance belonged to certain communities and periods, bringing figures of reversal into the cold. The low might mock the high. Youths might roam, sing, demand food or drink, perform comic scenes, or enact strange symbolic dramas. Such customs could unsettle order while also reinforcing it by containing disorder within appointed times. Winter allowed society to turn itself inside out briefly, then return to structure. The household itself observed small ceremonies. A special log might be brought to the hearth. Greenery might decorate a room where local custom permitted. Blessings might be spoken over food, animals, fields, doors, or tools. A mother might mark a child with a sign of protection. A father might tell a story he heard from his own father. An elder might recall winters so hard that present suffering seemed survivable by comparison. Memory was part of ritual. It placed the family inside a line of those who'd endured. Food customs carried deep emotional charge. The making of a special dish could involve everyone. Grain ground finer than usual, dough shaped carefully, meat roasted if available, spices used by the wealthy, herbs by the poor. A pudding boiled slowly, a pie cut open with steam rising, a shared cup passed. The senses declared that this day was not like every other day. In a season of sameness, difference was precious. Fasting and feasting formed a rhythm rather than a contradiction. Medieval Christianity did not present the body as something to be indulged without discipline. Fast days, abstinence, and penitential seasons shaped winter eating. This could be spiritually meaningful but physically difficult, especially for the poor, whose normal diet might already be sparse. Still, the rhythm itself gave order. Want became, at least sometimes, part of a sacred pattern rather than mere deprivation. For children, feast days could become the brightest points in the year. A sweet morsel, a song, a candle, a procession, a visit from kin, a day with less work, a story told late, a rare piece of meat. These formed memories strong enough to outlast many grey mornings. Childhood in winter was harsh, but festivity could light it with sudden colour. The medieval child learned that joy was not constant. It arrived in appointed flashes, and because it was rare, it burned fiercely. For the elderly, winter rituals carried another meaning. They had seen many turnings of the year. They knew which customs had faded, which songs had changed, which names were missing from the bench by the hearth. A feast day gathered the living, but it also summoned the dead in memory. The old measured time not only by calendars, but by absences. A cup lifted in winter might carry grief as well as cheer. The church bell was one of the great sounds of medieval time. In winter air, its voice could travel across fields and roofs, calling people from scattered houses into shared awareness. Bells marked worship, danger, death, celebration, and order. The bell told the village that it was not a collection of isolated fears, but a community moving through sacred time together. Even those too sick or weak to attend could hear the sound and know the day had meaning. There were tensions. Not every priest approved of every custom. Not every lord tolerated every gathering. Drinking could become violence. Games could become gambling. Seasonal misrule could become real disorder. Charity could become humiliation. Feasts could expose who had plenty and who had little. A household unable to celebrate might feel its poverty more sharply, precisely because others were celebrating. Yet the need remained. Human beings cannot live by calculation alone. A family that only counts grain and fuel may survive the body but starve the spirit. Medieval people understood, with the deep instinct of communities close to nature, that winter required more than endurance. It required defiance. Not the loud defiance of armies, but the quiet defiance of song in darkness, candle in frost, laughter in a smoky room. Bread shared when bread was scarce. Feast days did not deny suffering. They stood beside it. The sick still coughed. The poor still worried. The dead remained dead. The snow still lay on the fields. But for a few hours, time changed its face. The household lifted itself above the daily struggle and entered a story larger than hunger. Divine birth, saintly courage, communal memory, the turning of light, the promise that darkness was temporary. All these moved through winter ritual. This is why celebration mattered so deeply. It made survival social. It made cold meaningful. It turned the calendar into a ladder across the dark. Each holy day, each song, each shared cup, each flame before an image said that the family was not merely waiting for weather to change. It was participating in a world where suffering could be named, ordered, blessed, and, for a little while, softened. Imagine the room late at night. The feast is not grand. The table is rough. The pot is nearly empty. The children are drowsy. Someone hums the last line of a song. A candle has burned low, its small pool of light trembling against the wall. Outside, the frost holds the fields in silence. Inside, for one fragile evening, despair has not won. The cold remains, but so does the human voice. Wolves, roads, and winter fear. Beyond the door, medieval winter became a different world. The house held fire, breath, food, family, tools, animals, quarrels, songs, smoke, and the known shapes of daily life. Outside lay the fields stripped bare, the paths glazed with ice, the hedges black beneath frost, the woods crowded with shadow, and the road vanishing into weather. To step out in winter was to leave the fragile circle of human warmth and enter a landscape where distance itself became dangerous. Fear lived in that landscape, not always as panic, more often as caution, habit, and memory. Medieval people were not timid. They walked farther than many modern bodies can imagine. They crossed fields in darkness, drove animals through sleet, carried goods to market, visited churches, served lords, fetched water, gathered fuel, travelled for work, pilgrimage as war, marriage, trade, and law. But they understood that winter changed every road. A familiar path could become treacherous overnight. A shallow stream could swell. A ditch could disappear beneath snow. A frozen pond could hold one person and break beneath another. The world became beautiful and hostile at the same time. Roads were not the smooth, lit, maintained arteries of the modern age. Many were rutted tracks, muddy lanes, hollow ways, causeways, bridges in poor repair, footpaths through fields, and routes remembered by use rather than sign. In winter, mud could swallow wheels, frost could turn ruts into hard ridges, snow could erase direction, rain could transform low ground into a shining waste of water. A traveller might spend half a day crossing a distance that summer made simple. Travel demanded preparation, cloak tightened, hood drawn low, shoes checked, staff in hand, food wrapped, perhaps a knife at the belt, a lantern if one could be afforded, though light outside in wind and snow was difficult to protect. Those with animals faced additional burdens. A horse could slip, an ox could strain, a cartwheel could sink or break. Pack animals needed feed and care. Every mile consumed strength. The winter road was also social. A person alone was more vulnerable than one travelling with companions. Merchants gathered in groups. Pilgrims followed known routes. Messengers, officials, servants, and traders measured risk against necessity. A family might avoid sending a child out after dark unless need was urgent. Women travelling alone could face danger from weather, animals, and human violence. Men were not safe either. Hunger, debt, war, and lawlessness could turn other human beings into threats. Bandits, desperate wanderers, deserters, and thieves occupy a large place in medieval imagination and sometimes in medieval reality. Roads through forests, heaths, and borderlands could be feared for ambush. Yet the line between criminal and starving person could blur during hard times. A stolen cloak in winter was not merely property loss. It could be an assault upon survival. A sack of grain taken on the road could condemn a household to hunger. Theft in winter carried a sharper moral terror, because every object stolen was warm life removed from someone else. Wolves belonged to that fear in many regions. The medieval wolf was not simply a storybook creature. It was a real predator, intelligent, social, adaptable, and capable of testing the edges of human settlement. Wolves took livestock, especially sheep, young animals, weak creatures, and animals poorly guarded. In severe winters, when wild prey was scarce, they could become bolder near villages. Their presence shaped shepherding, enclosure, night travel, and imagination. The sound of wolves was powerful because it came from beyond the human circle. A howl in winter darkness carried distance into the room. It told the household that the fields were not empty. It moved through the blood before thought could tame it. Children heard warnings in that sound. Shepherds heard labour. Owners of animals heard loss. The old heard memories of winters when predators came close. To protect livestock, people used dogs, fences, folds, night shelter, watchfulness, and communal effort. Sheep might be brought nearer. Hens secured more carefully. Young animals sheltered. A village could organise hunts or drives when predators became a serious threat. Yet total safety was impossible. A wolf needed only one gap, one careless hour, one stormy night when people hesitated to leave the hearth. Dogs stood between human settlement and the wild. Not every dog was gentle or ornamental. Many were working creatures, guarding, herding, hunting, warning, scavenging, and sleeping where warmth allowed. A barking dog in the night could wake a house instantly. Its alarm might mean a fox, a stranger, a wolf, a loose animal, or nothing but wind. Still, people listened. In winter, listening was part of defence. The woods held other fears, not only wolves, but boar in some regions, wild cattle in earlier landscapes, deer that damaged crops, and lesser creatures that stole food or threatened animals. Yet the forest was never merely danger. It was fuel, fodder, nuts, berries, timber, pasture, hunting, herbs, shelter, and memory. Medieval people did not simply fear the woods. They used them, entered them, named them, argued over them, and depended upon them. Winter made the woodland more silent, its paths more obscure, its resources harder to reach, and its dangers more dramatic. A person gathering fuel in winter walked into negotiation with the landscape. The best fallen branches might lie deep under trees. Snow could conceal roots and holes. A load of sticks could unbalance the body on icy ground. Wet wood was heavy. A storm-damaged tree could shift without warning. A branch might fall. The cold numbed judgment. Returning home with fuel was a small victory repeated countless times. Water journeys were among the most ordinary dangers. If a household lacked a close well or reliable source, someone had to go to stream, spring, pond, or communal well. Ice around water is treacherous. A slip with a full bucket could bruise, break, soak, or drown. Wet skirts, hose, shoes, and sleeves became immediate threats. A person returning soaked in winter brought urgency through the door. Clothing had to be removed or dried, skin warmed, water saved if possible. Fire fed, frozen rivers could tempt travellers. Ice might shorten a route, turn water into road, and allow crossings impossible at other times. But ice lies. It thickens unevenly. It hides currents beneath a white skin. It cracks with a sound like a warning from the earth. A cart, horse, or group of people could break through. The cold shock of river water in winter was often fatal even if one escaped the current. The body lost heat quickly, clothing dragged downward, and the bank could seem impossibly far. Bridges were precious and frightening. A good bridge connected communities, markets, churches, mills, and lordly centres. A damaged bridge forced detours in freezing weather. Wooden planks became slick. Stone grew icy. and floodwater weakened supports. Crossing with animals or carts required nerve. Toll collectors or guards, or local authorities might control important bridges. Even passage across water could carry a price. Night intensified every danger. Medieval darkness was deep, away from fire and candle. The winter night belonged to stars, moon, cloud, and snow glow. A full moon on frost could make the world shine with strange clarity. A moonless night under cloud could erase the hand before the face. People knew routes by touch, sound, slope, hedge, ditch, and habit. But in storm or fog, even the experienced could lose direction. The fear of getting lost was not childish, it was rational. A person who missed a path in winter might wander until exhausted. Snow could cover landmarks, wind could distort sound. A light in the distance might be a house, a marsh glow, or imagination. The cold did not need to kill quickly. It could wait while strength drained. Sitting down in snow might feel like relief. Sleep might come gently. The danger of winter was that death could disguise itself as rest. Travellers sought shelter in inns, monasteries, barns, churches, manor houses, and the homes of kin or strangers. Hospitality was a moral duty in many settings, but it was also shaped by suspicion. A stranger at the door in winter might be a pilgrim, messenger, beggar, thief, deserter, runaway servant, or person carrying disease. To refuse shelter could feel cruel. To admit the wrong stranger could be dangerous. The closed door was not merely selfishness. It was judgment under pressure. Pilgrimage did not cease entirely in winter, though many journeys were harder. Those travelling for devotion might endure cold as penance, hope, or necessity. Roads to shrines carried the sick, the grateful, the desperate, and the curious. Some walked with crutches, offerings, tokens, or vows. The winter pilgrim moved through a landscape where hardship could be interpreted spiritually. Yet spiritual meaning did not make frozen feet less painful. Messengers and officials faced the cold because power required movement. Royal orders, manorial instructions, legal summons, news of war, market information, and letters had to travel. A delayed message could alter a court case, a payment, a military response, or a family decision. Winter slowed authority but did not stop it. Across muddy roads and frozen hills, the machinery of rule continued by horse, foot, cart, and memory. Markets drew people out despite danger. Salt, grain, fish, cloth, tools, livestock, candles, iron goods, and news might be worth the journey. A winter market was a place of steaming animals, red hands, muddy boots, shouted prices, huddled sellers, thin purses, and watchful eyes. A family might send its strongest walker, or several together, because the road was part of the cost of every purchase. To return safely with goods was a triumph not recorded in chronicles. War made roads more frightening. Soldiers, even when not in battle, consumed and threatened. A marching band could strip a village of food and fodder. Armed men on winter roads might demand shelter, seize animals, or take what they needed. Refugees fleeing conflict carried hunger and rumour ahead of them. The road became not a path of connection, but a vein through which fear travelled. Rumour itself moved powerfully in winter. A wolf seen near the fold, a thief on the road, a bridge out, a sickness in the next village, a lord's men collecting dues, a band of soldiers nearby, a miracle at a shrine, grain prices rising, a child lost in snow. Such news passed from traveller to household, from market to alehouse, from church porch to fireside. In a world without instant messages, rumour was both warning and distortion. People lived by it, doubted it, repeated it, and feared it. Supernatural fear also thickened winter travel. Lonely places gathered story, crossroads, ruins, burial grounds, woods, marshes, and old roads could be associated with spirits, demons, revenants, witches, fair beings, restless dead, or nameless presences. Modern certainty should not make us condescending. In darkness, cold, exhaustion, hunger, and isolation, the unseen becomes emotionally real. A strange sound in a winter wood does not wait for philosophy. It enters the skin. These beliefs shaped behavior. People crossed themselves, avoided certain paths, traveled in groups, carried blessed objects, timed journeys by daylight, sought the protection of saints, told children not to wander near places where danger, moral instruction, and supernatural warning fused into one. Fear educated the young, even when its language was symbolic. Yet courage was ordinary. That is important. Medieval people stepped outside constantly because life required it. They were not heroic in the theatrical sense. They were brave in the practical sense. They went to the well. They walked to church. They watched sheep. They drove carts. They fetched midwives. They carried news. They searched for animals. They buried the dead. They crossed fields in weather that would send many modern people indoors at once. The winter landscape demanded respect, and respect became knowledge. People learned the safest crossing, the ditch that filled first, the hill where wind cut hardest, the hollow where snow drifted deep, the tree line that marked direction, the sound of ice under pressure, the smell of snow, the behaviour of animals before storms. Their maps were not always written. They lived in the feet, the eyes, and the stories of the community. For families waiting at home, the absence of a traveller was a kind of suffering. The person sent to market should have returned by dusk. The child sent for water is taking too long. The man fetching wood is still beyond the hedge. The midwife has not arrived. The bell has sounded and someone is missing. Winter stretched minutes into dread. Every footstep outside might be the returning one. Every gust might only be wind. When the door finally opened and a figure entered with snow on the cloak, relief moved through the room like another kind of warmth. Goods were set down. News was spoken. Shoes were removed. Hands reached toward the fire. The outside world came in with the traveller, clinging to wool and breath. This is the truth of wolves, roads, and winter fear. The danger was not one thing. It was the convergence of cold, distance, animals, strangers, water, darkness, rumour, and human need. Families survived because they knew when to venture out and when to stay in. They survived because paths were remembered, neighbours watched, dogs barked, doors were barred, and courage was measured carefully. The medieval winter road did not promise arrival. It demanded humility, and every safe return was a small victory against the vast, cold uncertainty beyond the door. Thaw, flood, and reckoning. Spring did not arrive gently for the medieval family. It did not come first as flowers, birdsong, and warm light falling over green fields. It came as mud. It came as dripping thatch, swollen streams, broken paths, rotting straw, weak bodies, thin animals, and the discovery of what winter had taken. The thaw was not a rescue all at once, it was a reckoning. For months, the cold had held the world in a hard grip. Frost had sealed the ground. Snow had hidden filth, bones, ruts, waste, and damage. Ice had closed water and made roads strange. Then the season loosened. Roofs began to drip. Paths softened underfoot. Ditches filled. Rivers rose. Barnyards became black with churned manure. The earth, long locked, turned suddenly into mire. Mud was one of the great realities of medieval spring. It slowed carts, sucked at shoes, trapped hooves, fouled hems, and made every journey heavy. A person who had longed for the end of frost could find themselves cursing the thaw by noon. The same road that had been iron under winter could become a trough of brown water. A bucket carried from the well splashed filth onto clothing. Animals slipped. Children fell. Wheels broke. A simple errand became a struggle against the ground itself. Flood followed thaw in many places. Snow melt, rain, frozen soil unable to absorb water, and swollen rivers could overwhelm fields and settlements. Low land vanished beneath shining water. Bridges strained. Mills stood in danger. Stored goods in cellars or low buildings could be ruined. Hay already scarce might be spoiled. Fences floated away. Dung heaps spread into yards and streams. The thaw carried winter's waste into the living world. A flooded field was not merely an inconvenience. It delayed ploughing. It rotted seed. It drowned young growth. It prevented animals from grazing where they were desperately needed. It trapped communities behind water and mud when supplies were already lowest. Spring was supposed to renew life, but a wet spring could lengthen hunger until the household felt that winter had returned in another form. The human body entered this season weakened. Families had spent months in smoke, cold, crowding, limited food, and worry. Even those who had eaten every day might not have eaten well. The skin was pale, the muscles tired quickly. Children were thinner. The elderly moved slowly. Women who had nursed, laboured, cooked, mended, and watched the sick carried exhaustion in their bones. Men who had hauled fuel, managed animals, repaired damage, and faced the weather had less strength than autumn had given them. The first warmer days could therefore deceive. Sun on the wall might raise spirits, but the body didn't recover in a moment. Illness often lingered into the thaw. Coughs remained. Sores reopened. Fever visited the weakened. Dirty water spread stomach sickness. Damp bedding encouraged chills. In a world without modern sanitation, the melting season could release new dangers from beneath winter's cover. Animals, too, reached spring at the edge of endurance. Cattle had spent months on stored fodder, often poor by the end. Sheep were thin beneath their wool. Oxen might be weak just when ploughing demanded strength. Hens began to lay more as light returned, but only if they had survived and eaten enough. Lambs and calves, signs of renewal, were also fragile lives entering mud, cold rain, and disease. The arrival of new animals carried both joy and anxiety. A calf meant future milk, strength, or sale. A lamb meant wool and growth. Chicks meant eggs and meat. But birth required care. A newborn animal chilled quickly. A weak mother gave poor milk. Mud infected feet and wounds. Predators still watched. The family that had guarded livestock through winter now had to protect the next generation at its most delicate moment. The fields demanded labour before the household was ready. Ploughing could not wait forever. Seed time pressed with the authority of hunger. If the soil was too wet, the plough stuck or damaged the land. If the family waited too long, the growing season shortened. The judgment required was severe. Go too early, and the field suffered. Go too late, and the harvest suffered. Medieval farmers read the soil by touch, smell, colour, and memory. They lifted a clod and judged whether it crumbled or smeared. They watched birds, winds, clouds, puddles, and the behaviour of animals. Their science was intimate and practical, built through generations of risk. The oxen were harnessed, if they had lived and could pull. The plough cut into ground that had been stone hard only weeks before. Men guided, animals strained. Women and children helped when needed, carrying seed, breaking clods, clearing stones, bringing food, managing animals, repairing harness, and guarding the precious grain. Seed grain was a sacred kind of food, because it could not be eaten without stealing from the future. To cast it into the earth while the family still felt hunger required faith sharper than any sermon. This was one of spring's cruelest demands. The household might still be hungry, yet grain had to be planted, not cooked. A sack of seed could look like bread to a child. It could look like life withheld. But the family knew that eating the seed meant disaster later. So the seed went into the mud, and the people waited for green. Waiting was difficult. Early growth did not feed the family immediately. The first shoots of grain were promise, not meal. Gardens began to stir, but roots and leaves needed time. Milk might improve if animals recovered. Eggs might increase. Wild greens appeared, and people gathered them eagerly. Nettles, herbs, young leaves, and shoots could bring freshness to bodies starved of green food. Yet the great abundance was still far away. This period, often called the Hungry Gap, was among the most dangerous stretches of the year. Winter stores were low or gone. New crops were not ready. Animals were thin. Work was heavy. Bodies were weak. The household stood between memory and hope, between the last dry crust and the first real harvest. Many who survived the coldest months could still falter during the thaw. Foraging helped. People searched hedgerows, woods, streams, and meadows for whatever could be eaten safely. Young greens, roots, birds' eggs where taken, fish, shellfish in coastal places, small animals, herbs, and early plants all became important. Knowledge mattered intensely. Some plants nourished, some poisoned, some soothed, some only filled the belly briefly. Children learned the edible world by name, season, and caution. Water changed daily life again. Streams ran fast. Wells might be fouled. Ponds thawed. Mills resumed or struggled depending on flow. Washing became more possible, but also more miserable in cold, wet air. Clothing could be cleaned, bedding aired, tools rinsed, vessels scrubbed, but drying remained uncertain. A sunny day became an opportunity seized quickly. Blankets were carried outside. Straw was changed where possible. The house itself was open to air, letting winter's smoke and sourness drift out. That opening of the house was both practical and symbolic. Shutters lifted, doors stood wider. Light entered corners that had lived for months in shadow. The family saw what winter had done to the interior. Soot thick on rafters, bedding worn, pots cracked, tools dulled, walls stained by damp, stored goods depleted, shoes ruined, clothing thinned, a chair broken and never repaired, a roof leak missed in darkness. Spring revealed damage the cold season had hidden. Repair became urgent. Thatch had to be patched, fences rebuilt, ditches cleared, walls renewed with clay or daub, paths mended, garden beds prepared, animal pens cleaned, manure carted to fields, tools sharpened and handles replaced. Winter had been a season of endurance, but spring was a season of consequence. Everything neglected now demanded attention at once. The dead were also counted in memory. Not only human dead, though their absence was deepest, but animal losses, ruined stores, broken objects, failed obligations, debts increased, promises made in desperation. A family might look across the room and know who had not reached the thaw. A neighbour's door might open less often. A field might lack the man who once worked it. A widow might appear at church in altered clothing. Children might ask less often for someone whose name now made adults quiet. Communities took stock. Who needed help with ploughing? Whose ox had died? Who had seed to lend? Who owed rent and could not pay? Who had a daughter to marry? A son to place in service? a debt to settle, a roof to mend. Spring was not only biological renewal, it was social accounting. The village learned again the shape of its losses and obligations. The manor and church also reckoned rents, labour services, tithes, court matters, repairs, and seasonal tasks resumed with force. The Lord's fields needed attention. The priest watched parish life awaken around the calendar. Markets grew busier as movement improved. Those with surplus began to trade. Those with nothing sought work. The thaw released not freedom, but activity. Emotions shifted slowly. The first bird song after a long winter must have felt almost impossible. The first day warm enough to stand outside without pain. The first green shoots in the garden. The first egg after weeks of none. The first milk in better quantity. The first time children ran farther from the door. Relief arrived in fragments, not as a flood. Hope had to prove itself day by day, and still, danger remained. A late frost could kill young growth. Heavy rain could drown seed. Disease could follow dampness. Animals could miscarry or die. Food could run out before new nourishment arrived. Spring was a promise, not a guarantee. Medieval families had no romantic certainty that the worst was over because the snow had melted. Only time would tell what future weather would permit. This uncertainty shaped the medieval sense of the year. The seasons were not decorative changes in scenery. They were powers. Winter narrowed life. Spring exposed weakness. Summer demanded labour. Autumn judged the household's work. Then the cycle turned again. To survive once was not to be safe forever. Every year reopened the question. Yet the thaw also brought a kind of resurrection. Fields that had seemed dead breathed again. Trees budded, birds nested, streams shouted over stones. Smoke thinned in the rafters. Children stepped into light. Women spread cloth to dry. Men tested tools. Animals lifted their heads to new grass. The world, which had looked buried, had only been waiting. For the medieval family, spring was not softness. It was labour, mud, hunger, illness, repair, and risk. But it was also the return of possibility. The door opened wider, the sky rose higher, the earth, soaked and difficult, accepted seed. The household, worn by cold, began to move outward again. Every thaw asked a question. What remains? The answer stood in the surviving bodies, the living animals, the seed still saved, the roof still standing, the neighbours still near, the hands still able to work. And from that answer, however thin, the year began again. What winter made of them? Medieval winter left marks that no thaw could entirely erase. It marked the beams with smoke, the hands with cracks, the joints with ache, the memory with names of the dead, and the habits of the living with a caution so deep it became almost invisible. It taught families to count, to store, to mend, to share, to guard, to pray, to doubt, to wait, and to rise again when the room was cold and the day gave no promise of kindness. The people of the medieval world were not simple figures trapped in darkness. They were not merely victims of poverty, superstition, or bad weather. They were human beings of intelligence, discipline, imagination, fear, tenderness, ambition, humour, and grief. They knew their landscapes with a precision many modern people have lost. They understood wind by its direction, soil by its feel, animals by their breath, grain by its smell, cloth by its weight, and hunger by its silence. Winter sharpened that knowledge. A family learned where cold entered the house. It learned which child needed watching, which elder must sit closer to the fire, which neighbour might lend a tool, which path drifted deepest with snow, which animal would weaken first, which sack of grain had to be opened last. This was not written science in the language of universities, yet it was observation, testing, memory, and adaptation. It was a domestic science of survival. Modern archaeology helps us approach that lost intelligence with humility. Stratigraphic excavation reveals hearths rebuilt, floors renewed, and houses repaired across generations. Environmental analysis shows colder periods, changing woodland use, crop stress, and the pressures placed upon soil and settlement. Isotopic study can hint at diet and mobility. Skeletal remains can show malnutrition, disease, injury, repeated labour, and interrupted growth. Material culture. From spindle whorls to iron knives, from storage jars to worn shoes, gives us the tools by which ordinary life fought its private wars. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear every winter conversation. We cannot know the full tenderness of a hand resting on a fevered forehead, the exact taste of the last loaf, the private dread of a father opening a nearly empty bin, the anger of a widow facing rent with no strong animal left, the quiet triumph of a child who carried home dry kindling through snow. The past gives evidence, but it does not give everything. We stand at the edge of their vanished rooms, answerless, adrift to ponder. And yet the broad truth is clear. Medieval families survived the cold not through one miracle, but through 1,000 ordinary acts done in order. The roof patched before rain, the wood stacked before frost, the pig salted before decay, the cloak mended before the journey, the child wrapped before sleep. The seed saved though hunger begged for it, the fire banked before darkness, the prayer spoken when all practical measures had been taken and uncertainty remained. Winter made community necessary. No household, however proud, stood entirely alone. The village was a network of glances, debts, favours, suspicions, duties, and mutual need. A neighbour's fire could relight a dead hearth, a borrowed ox could save a field, a shared warning could prevent a dangerous journey, a bowl of broth could carry someone through illness, a church bell could gather scattered fear into common time. But community was never perfect. Medieval winter also exposed inequality. The lord's storehouse and the peasant's bin did not empty at the same rate. The wealthy could buy fuel, command labour, wear fur, and feast under high rafters. The poor counted sticks, stretched pottage, and wore patched wool until the cloth could bear no more. Cold fell from the same sky, but society determined how deeply it entered the body. This is one of the hard lessons winter leaves behind. Nature can be cruel, but human arrangements decide who stands most exposed. Land, law, inheritance, gender, age, health, debt, and status all shaped survival. A bad harvest was weather. A family left with too little after dues and rents was society. A frozen field was nature. A denied right to gather fuel was power. Yet even within such constraints, people acted. They were not passive shadows. They negotiated. They stored secretly. They used custom as defence. They helped kin. They took risks. They celebrated when possible. They taught children. They remembered better years. They mourned. They laughed. They endured. The emotional strength required is difficult to measure. To live through medieval winter was to live with uncertainty as a permanent companion. No one could know whether stores would last, whether fever would pass, whether animals would survive, whether spring would come early or late, whether war or tax or sickness would arrive from beyond the horizon. Life was not stable. It was managed. For the family, winter compressed existence into essentials: food, heat, shelter, clothing, health, labour, faith, kin. In modern life, comfort often hides the foundations of survival from view. A room warms at the touch of a switch. Food appears under bright lights. Water runs from a tap. Weather becomes inconvenience more often than judgment. Medieval winter reminds us that civilization rests upon fragile systems, and that beneath every era's confidence lies the old human need for warmth, bread, and another person nearby. There is dignity in remembering this, not because suffering is noble in itself. It is not. Cold, hunger, illness, and grief were not romantic. No child was improved by starvation. No mother was made holier by watching a baby weaken. No old man deserved to shiver because fuel was scarce. Hardship should not be beautified until its pain disappears. But dignity belongs to the people who met hardship with skill, care, and perseverance. They built walls that didn't fully keep out the wind, and still they made homes inside them. They cooked with smoke in their eyes, and still they fed one another. They owned little cloth, and still they patched warmth into being. They buried children, spouses, parents, neighbours, and animals, and still they planted seed. They lived close to death, but not only for death. They lived for harvest songs, feast lights, new calves, laughter near the hearth, the first green of spring, and the sight of loved faces in firelight. That is what winter made of them. It made them cautious, but not empty, practical, but not without wonder, religious, but not foolish, hardened, but not unfeeling, bound by labour, yet capable of joy, familiar with darkness, yet devoted to every form of light. When we imagine a medieval family in winter, let us not see only misery, let us see the whole room. The child asleep beneath a shared cloak, the woman turning thread into future warmth, the man listening to wind at the door, the elder remembering winters no one else can recall, the animal breathing in the byre, the pot steaming faintly, the fire reduced to embers, still alive beneath ash. Outside, the night is vast, frost lies on the fields, the road is hidden, the woods are black, the stars burn above a world without electric light, indifferent and magnificent. Inside, human beings have gathered what they can: wood, grain, wool, salt, stories, faith, hands. It is not enough to conquer winter, but it is enough to meet it, and perhaps that is the final truth carried to us from those distant centuries. Survival is rarely a grand victory. More often, it is a small flame protected through the night. It is the decision to rise when the floor is cold. It is the refusal to let the last ember die. It is the quiet belief that beyond the darkness, though no one can command it, morning may still come. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, what buried homes will be uncovered, what bones will speak, what soot-blackened beams will be dated, what forgotten village will rise again in the patient hands of excavation. But tonight, as we leave that winter room, we carry with us deeper knowledge of those who lived there. They were not distant from us because they lacked our comforts. They are near to us because they knew our oldest fears: cold, hunger, loss, love, and the longing to keep the people beside us alive until dawn. End of script. Good night.